there is a constellation in the night sky that most people have never noticed. It is faint, a loose scatter of stars between the constellations of Leo and Bootes, visible only on clear, dark nights, far from the glare of modern cities. The ancient astronomers called it Coma Berenices, the hair of Berenice, and the story of how a lock of a queen's hair came to be placed among the stars is one of the strangest, most beautiful, and most revealing episodes in the entire history of the ancient world. The hair belonged to Berenice II, Queen of Egypt, wife of Ptolemy III of Egypt, and one of the most remarkable women to wear the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. She was a woman who won chariot races at the great Pan-Hellenic Games of Greece, the sacred athletic competitions that were in the ancient world the closest equivalent to the modern Olympics. She was a woman who, according to the ancient sources, killed her first husband with her own hands when he betrayed her, driving a blade into the man who had been sent to marry her and who had instead taken her mother as his lover. She was a woman whose devotion to her second husband was so celebrated that when she cut a lock of her hair and dedicated it in a temple as an offering for his safe return from war, the disappearance of that lock from the temple became the subject of one of the most famous poems in ancient literature, and the basis for a constellation that still bears her name 2,300 years later. Berenice II was not a passive queen. She was not a consort who stood in the shadow of her husband and waited for history to happen around her. She was an athlete, a warrior, a political actor, and a religious figure whose public visibility exceeded that of almost any woman in the Hellenistic world. The numbers are striking. She ruled alongside Ptolemy III for roughly 24 years, from approximately 246 to 222 BC, during which time the Ptolemaic Empire reached its greatest territorial extent, stretching from Cyrenaica in the west to the borders of Mesopotamia in the east. She was worshipped as a goddess during her own lifetime, her cult established in temples across Egypt and the wider Ptolemaic sphere. She appeared on coins, not merely as a decorative element on her husband's currency, but as an independent figure. Her portrait struck on gold and silver issues that circulated throughout the eastern Mediterranean. But here is the problem. Despite all of this, despite the athletic victories, the political agency, the religious cult, the constellation that still bears her name, Berenice II is almost unknown to the modern world. She is not mentioned in most general histories of ancient Egypt. She does not appear in the popular documentary about the Ptolemaic dynasty. She is overshadowed completely and permanently by Cleopatra VII, the last Ptolemaic queen, the woman whose Roman-constructed legend has consumed so much cultural oxygen that no other Ptolemaic woman can breathe. Ask anyone to name a queen of Egypt, and they will say Cleopatra. Ask them to name a second one, and you will almost certainly be met with silence. And it gets stranger, because the erasure of Berenice II was not accomplished by Roman propagandists or by the passage of time alone. It was accomplished, in large part, by her own son, Ptolemy IV, the man who inherited the throne that Berenice had helped to build, the man whose very existence was a product of her body and her political alliances, almost certainly ordered his mother's murder. And the murder, like so many acts of dynastic violence in the Ptolemaic period, was followed by silence. The records do not dwell on the details. The court moved on. The queen who had won chariot races and dedicated her hair to the gods and been worshipped as a living goddess was dead, and the dynasty she had served continued without her, diminished, corrupted, but still functioning, still claiming the throne of the pharaohs, still performing the rituals that connected the living to the divine. By the end of tonight, you're going to understand the story of the queen, whose hair became a constellation, a woman who competed in the most prestigious athletic competitions in the ancient world and won, a woman who killed a man who wronged her and married a man who honored her, a woman who was worshipped as a goddess and murdered by her own child, and a woman whose extraordinary life has been forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because the history of powerful women is a graveyard of forgotten names. And Berenice II is buried deeper than most. She is buried beneath the fame of Cleopatra, beneath the monuments of the male pharaohs, beneath the structural biases of a recording system that celebrated male achievement and took female contribution for granted, buried, but not gone, because the constellation is still there, the poems are still there, and the story, when you look for it, is still waiting to be told. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It's a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now, let's begin. To understand Berenice II, you must first understand the world she came from, a world that was not Egypt but Cyrenaica, the Greek colonial territory on the coast of what is now eastern Libya, and you must understand the Ptolemaic dynasty into which she married. A dynasty that was, by the middle of the 3rd century BC, the most powerful and most culturally productive ruling house in the Mediterranean world. Cyrenaica was one of the oldest and most prosperous Greek colonies in North Africa. Its principal city, Cyrene, had been founded in the 7th century BC by settlers from the island of Thera, modern Santorini, and had grown over the centuries into a major centre of Greek culture, commerce, and intellectual life. The city was famous for its philosophers. Aristippus, the founder of the Cyrenaican school of philosophy, was born there, and for its agricultural wealth, particularly the production of silphium, a now extinct plant that was used as a spice, a medicine, and possibly a contraceptive, and that was so valuable that it appeared on the city's coins. The landscape of Cyrenaica was dramatic, a plateau rising from the Mediterranean coast, green and fertile in contrast to the desert that stretched to the south, watered by seasonal rains that supported agriculture and livestock in a region that was otherwise arid. The Greek settlers had built their cities along the coast and on the plateau's edge, Cyrene, Apollonia, Barca, Eusperides, creating a network of urban centres that were, in architecture and civic culture, indistinguishable from the great cities of mainland Greece. Berenice was born into the royal house of Cyrenaica, the daughter of King Magas of Cyrene and Queen Apama, who was herself the daughter of the Seleucid king Antiochus I. The marriage of Magas and Apama was a diplomatic alliance, one of the many intermarriages between the Hellenistic royal houses that were designed to create networks of kinship and obligation across the eastern Mediterranean. Berenice's bloodline was, from the moment of her birth, a political asset. She was connected, through her mother, to the Seleucid dynasty that ruled the vast territories stretching from Anatolia to Central Asia, and through her father to the independent kingdom of Cyrenaica, that controlled one of the most strategically important stretches of the North African coast. The Hellenistic world into which Berenice was born was a world of extraordinary political complexity. 3 major dynasties, the Ptolemies in Egypt, the Seleucids in Asia, and the Antigonids in Macedonia, competed for territory, influence, and prestige across the entire eastern Mediterranean and beyond. The competition was conducted through war, through diplomacy, and through marriage. The exchange of princesses between royal houses being one of the primary mechanisms by which alliances were formed, rivalries were managed, and the balance of power was maintained. Every princess was a diplomatic asset, every marriage was a treaty, and every child born of a dynastic marriage was a living embodiment of the alliance that had produced them. A living diplomatic document whose very existence testified to the political relationship between 2 ruling houses. Berenice occupied a particularly complex position in this web of dynastic relationships. Through her father she was connected to the Ptolemies. Magas was the stepson of Ptolemy I and had originally governed Cyrenaica as a Ptolemaic vassal. Through her mother she was connected to the Seleucids, the dynasty's great rival and the Ptolemies' most dangerous competitor. Her marriage to Ptolemy III would, in theory, reconcile these competing loyalties, binding Cyrenaica back to Egypt, neutralizing the Seleucid connection, and creating a unified Ptolemaic bloc that would stretch from the western desert of Libya to the eastern coast of the Nile Delta. King Magas had originally been a Ptolemaic vassal, appointed to govern Cyrenaica by his stepfather, Ptolemy I Soter. But Magas had ambitions of his own. He declared independence from the Ptolemaic court, fought a war against Ptolemy II Philadelphus, and established Cyrenaica as an autonomous kingdom. The break was not permanent. Magas and Ptolemy II eventually agreed to a reconciliation, sealed by the betrothal of Berenice to Ptolemy III, the heir to the Ptolemaic throne. But Magas died before the marriage could take place, and his death triggered a crisis that reveals, in vivid and violent detail, the world in which Berenice was raised. After Magas's death, his widow Apama, Berenice's mother, broke the betrothal arrangement and instead summoned a different suitor, Demetrius the Fair, a prince of the Macedonian Antigonid dynasty. The reasons for Apama's decision are debated. She may have preferred an alliance with the Antigonids, she may have resented the Ptolemaic court, or she may simply have been attracted to Demetrius, because what happened next suggests that the relationship between the Queen Mother and the Macedonian prince was not purely political. Demetrius arrived in Cyrene. He was supposed to marry Berenice. Instead, he became Apama's lover. The ancient sources describe the situation with scandalous detail. Demetrius was openly conducting an affair with the mother of his intended bride. He was living in the palace, exercising authority that was not his, alienating the Cyrenean aristocracy with his haughty manner and his presumptuous exercise of authority. The situation was intolerable, a personal humiliation for Berenice and a political crisis for the kingdom. The political dimension of the crisis deserves emphasis. Demetrius was not merely an unfaithful fiancé, he was a representative of the Antigonid dynasty, the dynasty that controlled Macedonia and that competed with both the Ptolemies and the Seleucids for influence in the eastern Mediterranean. By becoming Apama's lover and establishing himself in the Cyrenean court, Demetrius was effectively attempting to add Cyrenaica to the Antigonid sphere of influence, displacing the Ptolemaic alliance that Magas had arranged and replacing it with an Antigonid one. The affair was not merely a scandal, it was a coup, a slow-motion takeover of the Cyrenean state by a foreign prince who was using the Queen Mother's bed as his base of operations. Berenice's response was swift, violent, and decisive. According to the ancient sources, she organized the murder of Demetrius. Some accounts describe her personally entering her mother's bedroom and killing Demetrius while he lay in Apama's arms. The image is vivid. A young woman, barely out of her teens, standing over the body of the man who had betrayed her, her mother screaming in the background, the blood spreading across the sheets. Other accounts are less theatrical but equally clear. Soldiers were sent, the deed was done, Demetrius was dead, Apama was spared, and Berenice, the princess who had been humiliated, who had been betrayed by her own mother, who had been treated as a pawn in a dynastic chess game, had demonstrated that she was no pawn. She was a player, and she was willing to kill to prove it. The marriage to Ptolemy III took place around 246 BC. The union was everything that the original betrothal had promised, a dynastic merger that reunited Cyrenaica with Egypt. Berenice was approximately 21 years old when she arrived in Alexandria as the new Queen of Egypt. She was a woman who had already demonstrated extraordinary personal courage, a woman who had killed a man, defied her mother, and secured her own political future through an act of violence that would have been remarkable for a king, let alone a princess. She had proved her capacity for decisive action under conditions of extreme personal and political pressure. She had shown that she understood the dynamics of power, that she could distinguish between threats that could be tolerated and threats that had to be eliminated, and that she was willing to act when the situation demanded it, regardless of the personal cost or the social conventions that might have inhibited a less determined woman. She had shown, in short, that she was capable of ruling, that the qualities of judgment, courage, and strategic thinking that were expected of a king were present in abundance in this young princess from the coast of North Africa, and she was about to enter the most powerful court in the ancient world, the court of the Ptolemies, the dynasty that controlled the city of Alexandria, the Great Library, the Mauritian Research Institute, and the richest grain-producing territory in the Mediterranean. The transition from Cyrene to Alexandria would have been dramatic in every sense. Cyrene, for all its intellectual distinction and agricultural prosperity, was a provincial city, a small Greek polis on the edge of the Libyan desert, with a population measured in tens of thousands rather than hundreds of thousands. Alexandria was a metropolis, the largest city in the Mediterranean world, a cosmopolitan capital where Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and Syrian communities lived in close proximity, where the languages of a dozen nations could be heard in the marketplace, where the immense wealth of the Nile Valley and the far-reaching trade networks of the entire eastern Mediterranean converged in a commercial and cultural centre that had no rival on earth. The royal quarter alone would have dwarfed anything Berenice had experienced in Cyrene. The palace complex occupied roughly a quarter of the entire city, a vast precinct of gardens, pavilions, temples, administrative buildings, the Mausion with its famous library, the Serapeum where the cult of Serapis was maintained, the harbour facilities that served the royal fleet, and the residential quarters where the royal family lived in a style of luxury that was legendary throughout the ancient world. The Ptolemies did not merely rule Egypt, they displayed their rule in the architecture of their capital, in the extravagance of their court ceremonies, in the quality of the art and literature they patronized, and in the public festivals that periodically turned the broad avenues and harbours and public squares of Alexandria into elaborate theatres of royal power and divine majesty. The religious dimension of the Ptolemaic monarchy also required adjustment. In Cyrene, the gods were Greek: Zeus, Apollo, Artemis, the standard deities of the Greek pantheon worshipped in the standard Greek manner. In Alexandria, the gods were both Greek and Egyptian, or, more precisely, the Ptolemaic state had developed a syncretic religious system that fused Greek and Egyptian divine identities into new forms. The god Serapis, a creation of the early Ptolemaic period, combining elements of the Egyptian gods Osiris and Apis with the Greek gods Zeus, Hades, and Asclepius, was the patron deity of Alexandria and the focus of a cult that extended across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The queen was expected to participate in both Greek and Egyptian religious observances, to make offerings to the Greek gods in the Greek manner, and to appear in Egyptian temple reliefs in the traditional Egyptian pharaonic pose. The dual religious identity of the Ptolemaic monarchy was one of its most distinctive features, and one of the most demanding aspects of the queen's public role. Berenice adapted to this complex environment with apparent ease. The evidence, such as it is, suggests that she was accepted by the Alexandrian court, that she established effective working relationships with the Egyptian priesthood, and that she assumed the religious and ceremonial responsibilities of the great royal wife without significant difficulty. Her experience in Cyrene, where she had navigated the dangerous politics of a royal court in crisis, where she had demonstrated both the willingness to act decisively and the judgment to spare her mother, even as she killed the man who had dishonored her, had prepared her for the challenges of the Ptolemaic court. She was not an innocent who stumbled into the most complex political environment in the ancient world. She was a survivor, a woman who had been tested by crisis, and who had proved herself capable of operating at the highest levels of political and personal danger. The coinage of Berenice's reign provides important evidence for her public image. Several series of gold and silver coins were issued bearing Berenice's portrait, either alone or in conjunction with Ptolemy III. The portraits show a woman of dignified appearance, her hair arranged in the style that was typical of Hellenistic royal portraiture, her features rendered with the idealization that was standard for royal coin portraits, but also with enough individuality to suggest that the engravers were working from life rather than from a generic template. The coins circulated throughout the eastern Mediterranean. They have been found in hoards from Egypt, from Syria, from the Aegean Islands, and from the Greek mainland. They were, in effect, ambassadors, carrying Berenice's image to every corner of the Ptolemaic sphere of influence and declaring, to anyone who handled them, that the Ptolemaic state was governed by a royal pair whose authority was endorsed by the gods, and whose excellence was manifest in every aspect of their public presentation. The Ptolemaic court that Berenice entered was an institution of extraordinary complexity and sophistication. It was simultaneously Greek and Egyptian, operating in the Greek language and according to Greek cultural norms, while maintaining the ancient Egyptian religious institutions, and presenting the pharaoh as a living god in the Egyptian tradition. The court was the center of patronage for the greatest intellectual and artistic community in the ancient world. The poets Callimachus, Apollonius of Rhodes, and Theocritus, three of the most important literary figures in Hellenistic culture, were all associated with the Ptolemaic court. The scientists Euclid and Eratosthenes worked in the Mautian under Ptolemaic patronage. The engineers who designed the Pharos lighthouse, one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, served the Ptolemaic state. The wealth that funded this extraordinary flowering of culture came from the Egyptian agricultural system, the annual flood of the Great Nile that deposited its rich and fertile silt on the farmland and produced the grain surpluses that made Egypt the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. The scale of Alexandria in the mid-3rd century BC deserves emphasis because it provides the physical and cultural backdrop against which Berenice's entire life as queen unfolded. The city was the largest in the Mediterranean world, larger than Rome, which was still in the early stages of its expansion from a regional Italian power to a Mediterranean empire, larger than Carthage, larger than Antioch, larger than any other urban centre in the ancient world at that time. Its population is estimated at between 300,000 and 500,000 people, a cosmopolitan and polyglot mix of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, Syrians, Nubians, and merchants and travellers from across the entire known world. The city was organised along a grid plan. Its main avenue, the Canopic Way, stretched for roughly 5 kilometres from the east to the Gate of the Moon in the west, lined with colonnades and punctuated by temples, public buildings, and the residences of the wealthy. The royal quarter occupied the northeastern section of the city, facing the harbour. A complex of palaces, gardens, the Mautian, and the famous library that together constituted the administrative and intellectual heart of the Ptolemaic state. The library was, in the mid-3rd century, at the height of its powers, under the leadership of scholars like Callimachus, who served as a cataloguer and poet rather than as the head librarian. Despite later tradition, the collection was being systematically organised and expanded. Callimachus produced the Pinax, a comprehensive bibliography of Greek literature organised by genre and author that was, in effect, the first library catalogue in history. The Pinax classified the entirety of Greek literary production, poetry, prose, philosophy, history, science, rhetoric, into categories that would influence the organisation of knowledge for centuries. It was in this atmosphere of systematic intellectual endeavour, this world of catalogues and classifications, of scholarly additions and literary criticism, of scientific observation and mathematical proof, that Berenice took her place as queen. The relationship between the Ptolemaic queens and the intellectual life of the court was not merely ceremonial. The queens were patrons. They commissioned works of art and literature. They funded scholarly research. They established cults and festivals that required the production of hymns, prayers, and ritual texts. Arsinoe II, the great queen of the previous generation, whose marriage to her brother Ptolemy II had established the pattern of sibling marriage that would characterize the later Ptolemaic dynasty, had been a particularly active patron. She had commissioned works from Callimachus and other court poets. She had established religious cults in her own honour. She had appeared on coins and in temple reliefs as a figure of divine authority. Berenice inherited this tradition of active queenly patronage and expanded it. The evidence for Berenice's patronage comes primarily from the literary works that were produced in her honour. The Callimachus poem on the lock of hair is the most famous, but it was not the only work associated with Berenice. Posidippus of Pella, a poet whose epigrams were discovered on a papyrus in Milan in the 1990s, providing scholars with an extraordinary cache of new Hellenistic poetry, composed epigrams celebrating Berenice's chariot victories and her divine status. The discovery of the Posidippus papyrus was one of the most important literary finds of the 20th century. It provided direct evidence for aspects of Ptolemaic court culture that had previously been known only from indirect references and secondary sources. The papyrus contained more than 100 epigrams organized by theme, epigrams on gemstones, on shipwrecks, on bird augury, on equestrian victories, and on the dedications made by Ptolemaic royals in temples across the Greek world. Among the revelations of the papyrus was the extent to which Berenice II had been celebrated in contemporary poetry, not merely as a consort, but as an independent figure worthy of literary attention in her own right. The equestrian epigrams in the Posidippus collection are particularly significant because they provide the most detailed evidence we have for Berenice's athletic career. The poems describe chariot victories at specific games, identifying the festival, the type of race, and the outcome, with the precision that the Greek world demanded of its athletic records. The language of the poems is celebratory, but also technically specific. It uses the vocabulary of Greek athletics, the terminology of chariot racing, and the well-established conventions of the victory epigram that had been created by poets like Pindar and Bacchylides centuries earlier. The poems place Berenice in a tradition, the tradition of athletic excellence celebrated in verse, that was one of the most ancient and prestigious in all of Greek culture. The chariot itself, the vehicle in which Berenice competed, was one of the most expensive and technically demanding forms of athletic equipment in the ancient world. A competitive chariot team required the finest horses available, bred for speed, endurance, and the ability to work in tandem with a team of 3 other horses. The training of the horses was a specialized skill that required years of experience. The construction of the chariot was the work of expert craftsmen. The vehicle had to be light enough for speed, but strong enough to survive the violent turns and collisions of the racecourse. And the maintenance of the entire operation, the stable, the training ground, the grooms, the trainers, the drivers, required a level of financial investment that was available only to the wealthiest individuals in the Greek world. By competing at this level, Berenice was declaring her membership in the most exclusive social class in the ancient world, the class of those who could afford to pursue athletic glory as an expression of personal and familial excellence. The investment was enormous, not merely in money but in time, in expertise, and in the organizational capacity required to manage a competitive stable over multiple seasons and at multiple game sites across the Greek world. The horses had to be transported by ship from Egypt to Greece, a voyage that was itself expensive and risky, requiring specialized vessels and experienced handlers. The entire operation, from the breeding of the horses, to their training, to their transportation to the game site, to the race itself, was a logistical undertaking that rivaled a small military campaign in its complexity and cost, and Berenice managed it, or at least oversaw its management, while simultaneously fulfilling her duties as queen of the most complex state in the Mediterranean world. Berenice entered this world not as a passive consort but as an active participant. She brought with her the political connections of the Cyrenean royal house, connections to the Seleucid dynasty through her mother, and to the aristocracy of Cyrenaica through her father. She brought the personal qualities that she had demonstrated in the Demetrius affair: courage, decisiveness, and an absolute refusal to be marginalized. And she brought something else, something that was, in the context of the Greek world, truly extraordinary for a woman. She brought athletic glory. Berenice II was a competitive chariot racer. She entered her horses, or more precisely, her chariot team, in the great Panhellenic Games of Greece, and she won. The evidence comes from multiple sources. An epigram attributed to Posidippus celebrates Berenice's victories in the chariot races at the Nemean Games, one of the 4 great Panhellenic festivals alongside the Olympics at Olympia, the Pythian Games at Delphi, and the Isthmian Games at Corinth. The victories were genuine athletic achievements, not honorary awards given to a queen out of deference, but competitive victories won in open competition against the entries of other wealthy and powerful individuals from across the Greek world. The significance of these victories cannot be overstated. In the Greek world, athletic competition was one of the most important expressions of social status, personal excellence, and civic identity. The great Panhellenic Games were sacred events, held in honor of the gods, attended by spectators from across the Greek-speaking world, and governed by rules that were enforced with religious authority. Victory at the Games conferred a form of prestige that was unique in Greek culture, a prestige that transcended wealth, political power, and even military success. Olympic victors were celebrated in poetry. Pindar's victory odes, composed for Olympic champions in the 5th century BC, are among the masterpieces of Greek literature. victors were honored with statues erected at the sanctuary sites. Their names were recorded in the official victory lists that the Greeks maintained with the same meticulous care they devoted to their genealogies, their foundation myths, and their chronicles of war and governance. To win at the Pan-Hellenic Games was to demonstrate arete, the Greek concept of excellence, of being the best, of achieving a form of perfection that was both physical and spiritual. Berenice's victories placed her in this tradition, a tradition that was, in almost every other context, exclusively male. Women were not permitted to compete at the Olympic Games at Olympia. They were not even permitted to attend as spectators. Under penalty of being thrown from the cliff of Mount Typaeum, the athletic world of ancient Greece was, with very few exceptions, a male preserve. The exceptions were rare and significant. Spartan women were trained in athletics as part of their civic education, running, wrestling, and throwing the javelin alongside their male peers in a system that was unique in the Greek world, and that other Greeks regarded with a mixture of admiration and discomfort. A few wealthy women had entered chariot teams at Olympia. The rules permitted the owner of the horses, rather than the driver, to claim the victory, and some women exploited this provision to participate in the games by proxy. The most famous was Cyniska of Sparta, who won the four-horse chariot race at the Olympics in 396 and 392 BC, the first woman in history to achieve an Olympic victory. But Berenice's victories at Nemea were different in kind from Cyniska's Olympic victories in an important respect. They were not quiet, discreet entries made under cover of a technicality. They were celebrated, publicly, prominently, in poetry that was commissioned by the Ptolemaic court, and that presented Berenice's athletic success as evidence of divine favour and royal excellence. The celebration was deliberate. It was a statement, a declaration that this queen was not merely a political figure, but a figure of personal excellence, a woman who had demonstrated her superiority in the most competitive arena the Greek world had to offer. The connection between athletic victory and divine status was central to Berenice's public image. In the Greek world, victors at the Great Games were believed to have been touched by the gods, to have received a form of divine grace that manifested as physical superiority. By winning at the Pan-Hellenic Games, Berenice was not merely demonstrating her skill as a horse breeder and trainer. She was claiming a form of divine endorsement, a public demonstration that the gods favoured her, that she was worthy of the honour she received, that her position at the apex of the Ptolemaic state was not merely a product of marriage and politics, but of genuine personal excellence. This was the woman who would cut a lock of her hair and dedicate it in a temple, and who would, through that simple act of devotion, create a legend that would endure for more than 2 millennia. The athlete, the killer, the queen, the goddess. Berenice II was all of these things, and the world has largely forgotten every one of them. The core problem of Berenice II's story is the lock of hair, not because the hair itself matters, but because the story of the hair reveals everything about how Berenice's legacy was constructed, celebrated, and ultimately lost. The story begins in 246 BC, shortly after Berenice's marriage to Ptolemy III. Almost immediately after the wedding, Ptolemy launched a major military campaign, the Third Syrian War, also known as the Laodicean War, against the Seleucid Empire. The war was triggered by a succession crisis in the Seleucid court, the murder of Ptolemy's sister, Berenice Syra, who had been married to the Seleucid king Antiochus II as part of a diplomatic arrangement. When Antiochus died, his first wife Laodice orchestrated the murder of Berenice Syra and her infant son, seizing control of the Seleucid succession for her own children. Ptolemy III went to war to avenge his sister, or, more accurately, to exploit the crisis as an opportunity to expand Ptolemaic territory at Seleucid expense. The campaign was spectacularly successful. Ptolemy's army swept through Syria, captured the Seleucid capital of Antioch, advanced as far as Mesopotamia, and returned with enormous quantities of plunder, including, according to Egyptian sources, the sacred statues of Egyptian gods that the Persians had carried off during their conquest of Egypt more than 2 centuries earlier. The return of these statues was a propaganda triumph of the First Order. It allowed Ptolemy to present himself as the restorer of Egyptian religion. the pharaoh who had recovered the gods that the foreign invaders had stolen. The title Euergetes, benefactor, that Ptolemy adopted was a direct reference to this achievement. But before Ptolemy departed for the war, Berenice made a vow. She cut a lock of her hair and dedicated it in a temple, probably the temple of Arsinoe-Aphrodite at Cape Zephyrium near Alexandria, as an offering to the gods for her husband's safe return. The dedication of hair was a traditional Greek religious practice, a form of devotion that was associated with moments of transition, anxiety, and petition to the divine. By cutting her hair and placing it in the temple, Berenice was performing a public act of wifely devotion, declaring, in a way that was visible to the entire court, that she was willing to sacrifice a part of herself for her husband's safety. The hair disappeared from the temple. The circumstances of the disappearance are unclear. It may have been stolen, it may have deteriorated, it may have been deliberately removed for reasons that are no longer recoverable. What matters is what happened next. The court astronomer, Conon of Samos, a mathematician and scientist of considerable reputation who was associated with the Mausian at Alexandria, announced that the lock of hair had not been lost. It had been taken up to heaven. The gods, moved by Berenice's devotion, had placed her hair among the stars. Conon identified a group of faint stars near the constellation of Leo and declared that this was Coma Berenice's, the hair of Berenice, a new constellation that would shine in the night sky as an eternal testament to the Queen's piety and love. The announcement was, of course, a masterpiece of court flattery. Conon was a court intellectual, dependent on Ptolemaic patronage for his livelihood and his access to the resources of the Mausian. His discovery of a constellation named after the Queen was a political act as much as an astronomical one, a declaration that the Ptolemaic dynasty was favoured by the gods, that its queen was worthy of celestial honour, that the very heavens testified to the excellence of the ruling house. The announcement was propaganda, dressed in the language of science. But the propaganda was elevated into art by the poet Callimachus, one of the most influential literary figures of the Hellenistic world. Callimachus composed a poem celebrating the transformation of Berenice's hair into a constellation, a work that was later translated into Latin by the Roman poet Catullus, whose version survives and is one of the most admired poems in Latin literature. The poem is written from the perspective of the lock of hair itself, a conceit that allows Callimachus to speak simultaneously as a devotional object, a celestial body, and a voice of female devotion. The hair describes its journey from the queen's head to the temple to the heavens, lamenting its separation from the queen it loved, while celebrating its elevation to divine status. The poem is witty, moving, and technically brilliant, a masterpiece of Hellenistic poetic art that transforms a piece of court propaganda into a meditation on love, loss, devotion, and the relationship between the human and the divine. The Callimachus poem, and particularly the Catullus translation, which preserved it for posterity when the Greek original was largely lost, ensured that the story of Berenice's hair would survive for more than 2,000 years. The poem's survival is itself a story worth telling. Callimachus wrote the original in Greek, probably in the 240s BC, shortly after the events it describes. The poem was part of the Aetia, a longer work that told the origin stories of various Greek customs, festivals, and institutions. The Aetia was one of the most influential works of Hellenistic poetry, admired for its learning, its wit, and its technical virtuosity. But it did not survive intact. Like so much of ancient literature, it was lost during the long centuries when the classical heritage was being gradually destroyed by neglect, war, religious upheaval, and the simple deterioration of the papyrus on which it was written. What survived of the Lock of Hair poem survived largely through Catullus, the Roman poet who, writing roughly 2 centuries after Callimachus, translated the Greek original into Latin with such skill and fidelity that his version became one of the touchstones of Latin poetry. Catullus's version, known as Poem 66 in the standard numbering of his collected works, preserves the essential conceit of the original. The lock of hair speaks in the first person, describing its journey from the queen's head to the temple to the heavens. The hair laments its separation from Berenice. It was happy on the queen's head, it says, and it regrets being cut, even though the cutting was an act of devotion. It describes the moment of its apotheosis, the moment when the gods took it up from the temple and placed it among the stars. And it addresses the queen directly, asking Berenice to continue making offerings to it in its new celestial form. The poem is at once a work of astronomical flattery, a meditation on devotion and sacrifice, and a surprisingly moving exploration of the relationship between the physical and the divine, between the body that is mortal and the name that, through the grace of art and astronomy, becomes immortal. The astronomical dimension of the story deserves careful attention because it illustrates the unique interaction between science, poetry, and politics that characterized the Ptolemaic court. Conon of Samos, the astronomer who identified the constellation, was not merely a flatterer. He was a genuine scientist, a mathematician whose rigorous mathematical work on conic sections was known to, valued by, and explicitly cited by the great Archimedes of Syracuse. His identification of Coma Berenices as a distinct stellar grouping was, whatever its political motivations, an act of astronomical observation, a recognition that the faint stars between Leo and Bootis constituted a distinct visual unit that could be named and catalogued. The constellation was real, the stars were real, the political motivation was also real, but the interaction of science and politics produced something that transcended both. A piece of the night sky that still bears the name of a Ptolemaic queen, long after the dynasty, the kingdom, and the civilization that created it have vanished from the earth. The constellation Coma Berenices is still recognized by modern astronomers. It is one of the 88 official constellations defined by the International Astronomical Union. The region of the sky it occupies is, for modern astronomers, far more significant than Conon of Samos could have imagined. The Coma Berenices galaxy cluster, a collection of more than 1,000 galaxies located approximately 320 million light-years from Earth, is one of the nearest large galaxy clusters to our own and has been the subject of extensive astronomical research. The Coma cluster was instrumental in the discovery of dark matter. The astronomer Fritz Zwicky, studying the cluster in the 1930s, observed that the galaxies within it were moving too fast to be held together by the visible matter alone, leading him to propose the existence of invisible mass that has since been confirmed as one of the most important components of the universe. Every time a modern astronomer points a telescope at the Coma Berenices cluster to study the distribution of dark matter in the universe, they are looking at a region of the sky that bears the name of a woman who cut her hair in a temple in Alexandria more than 2,300 years ago. The irony is exquisite. Berenice's name is written in the stars, literally, permanently, in a form that cannot be erased by chisels or obscured by propaganda or lost through neglect. And yet the woman behind the name has been forgotten. The constellation survives. The queen is a ghost. The memorialization succeeded beyond anything Conon or Callimachus could have imagined, and the memory failed because the system that was capable of placing a woman's name among the stars was not capable of recording her life with the same care it brought to recording her husband's military campaigns. And yet, and this is the paradox that lies at the heart of Berenice's story, the name has survived while the woman has been forgotten. Most people who know the constellation Coma Berenices do not know who Berenice was. They do not know she was a queen. They do not know she was an athlete. They do not know she killed a man in her mother's bedroom. They do not know she was murdered by her own son. The name is there, in the sky, in the star catalogues, in the astronomical databases, but the person behind the name has vanished. The memorialization succeeded. The memory failed. The constellation is permanent. The woman is a ghost. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The disappearance of Berenice from historical memory is not merely a function of the passage of time. It is a function of the same structural forces that have erased or distorted the legacies of every other woman we have examined in this series. Berenice was powerful. Berenice was visible. Berenice was celebrated in her own lifetime by some of the greatest artists and intellectuals of the ancient world, and she has been forgotten. Not because she was unimportant, but because the recording system that preserved male achievements did not extend the same courtesy to female ones. The poetry survived. The astronomy survived. The woman did not. The Third Syrian War, the campaign for which Berenice cut her hair, provides the context for understanding the political dimension of her role. The war was one of the most ambitious military enterprises in Ptolemaic history. Ptolemy III's armies advanced further into Asia than any Ptolemaic force before or after, reaching, according to some ancient accounts, as far as Bactria in modern Afghanistan. The territories conquered during the war expanded the Ptolemaic sphere of influence to its greatest extent, creating a maritime and territorial empire that stretched from the shores of Libya to the borders of India. And while Ptolemy was away at war, someone had to govern Egypt. The ancient sources do not explicitly describe Berenice as a regent during Ptolemy's absence. The Ptolemaic recording system was not designed to document the administrative activities of queens in the way it documented the military campaigns of kings. But the logic of the situation is clear. Ptolemy was absent from Egypt for an extended period. The campaign lasted months, possibly years. The kingdom needed governance. The grain had to be collected. The taxes had to be administered. The temples had to be maintained. The bureaucracy had to function. Someone had to make decisions. And the most likely person to make those decisions, the person with the highest status, the greatest political authority, and the most direct interest in the stability of the kingdom, was the queen. The hypothesis that Berenice governed Egypt during Ptolemy's absence is not merely plausible. It is, given the structure of the Ptolemaic state and the precedents established by earlier Ptolemaic queens, almost certain. Arsinoe II had wielded enormous political authority during the reign of her husband Ptolemy II. She had been co-regent in all but name. Her image appeared on the coinage, her name appeared in official documents, and foreign powers addressed her as a sovereign in her own right. The precedent for active queenly governance was well established. And Berenice, a woman who had demonstrated her political capability by organizing the assassination of Demetrius the Fair before she was 20, was exactly the kind of person who would have been entrusted with the governance of the state during her husband's absence. The administrative responsibilities that Berenice would have managed during the Third Syrian War were enormous. The Egyptian economy was the most centralized and most bureaucratically administered in the ancient world. The state controlled the production and distribution of grain, oil, linen, papyrus, and other essential commodities. It collected taxes through a network of local officials whose accounts were reviewed by regional administrators, whose reports were compiled at the central administration in Alexandria. It maintained the irrigation system, the canals, the dikes, the drainage channels, on which the agricultural productivity of the Nile Valley depended. It funded the temple establishments, paying the salaries of the priests, supplying the materials for the rituals, maintaining the physical fabric of the temple buildings. It operated the royal monopolies, the state-controlled industries that produced beer, oil, and textile products, and that generated a significant portion of the royal revenue. Managing this system required not just authority but expertise, a detailed understanding of how the bureaucracy functioned, where the pressure points were, and how to keep the machinery of government operating smoothly during the disruption of wartime. The Greek literary tradition, the poets and historians who recorded the events of the Hellenistic period, did not consider administrative competence a suitable subject for literary celebration. Poetry celebrated military victories, athletic triumphs, romantic devotion, and divine favor. It did not celebrate the management of grain supplies or the supervision of tax collection. The result is that Berenice's most substantive achievement, keeping the Ptolemaic state functioning during a major military campaign, is the achievement that left the least trace in the surviving record. The poetry celebrated her hair. It did not celebrate her governance. The astronomy celebrated her devotion. It did not celebrate her administration. The constellation preserves the story of a lock of hair cut in a temple. It does not preserve the story of a queen running a kingdom. And it gets worse. Because the governance that Berenice almost certainly provided during the Third Syrian War is completely undocumented. No inscription records her decisions. No papyrus preserves her orders. No stela commemorates her administration. The kingdom functioned. The grain was collected. The temples were maintained. The bureaucracy operated. But the record attributes nothing to the woman who almost certainly made it happen. The question of Berenice's personal relationship with Ptolemy III is one that the sources tantalize but do not resolve. The hair dedications suggest genuine affection. A wife who was willing to sacrifice something precious for her husband's safety, a woman whose love for her partner was real enough to inspire one of the greatest poems of the age. But the Ptolemaic court was not a place where personal affection was easily distinguishable from political performance. Every public act of devotion was also a political statement. Every expression of love was also an assertion of loyalty. The hair dedication may have been an act of genuine love. It may have been a calculated public relations gesture. It was probably both, a moment where personal emotion and political calculation converged, as they often did in the lives of Ptolemaic royals, producing an act that was simultaneously authentic and strategic. Something is wrong with our assumptions when a woman who governed one of the most powerful kingdoms in the ancient world during a period of military crisis leaves no administrative record at all. Something is wrong with a recording system that documented the exact weight of the gold and silver plundered from the Seleucid treasury, recording every talent, every mina, every ingot with the meticulous precision that the Ptolemaic bureaucracy brought to all its accounting, but could not be bothered to note who ran the government while the plundering was being done. The priorities of the record are, once again, painfully and instructively revealing. They tell us, with perfect clarity, what the culture valued and what it did not. And what the culture valued was war and plunder. What it did not value, or at least did not value enough to record, was the administrative labor of the woman who kept the kingdom functioning while the king was away winning glory. The cult of Berenice, her deification during her own lifetime, provides another dimension for her public importance, and another dimension of frustration for those seeking to understand the real woman behind the divine persona. Berenice was worshipped as a goddess in temples across Egypt and the wider Ptolemaic sphere. She was associated with Aphrodite, the goddess of love and beauty, and with Isis, the Egyptian goddess who embodied the ideals of wifely devotion, maternal power, and divine authority. The association with Aphrodite was partly a consequence of the hair dedication. The lock was placed in a temple of Arsinoe Aphrodite, and the constellation that bore Berenice's name was, by extension, associated with the sphere of Aphrodite's influence. The association with Isis was a standard element of Ptolemaic queenly identity. Every Ptolemaic queen was to some degree identified with Isis, and Berenice's identification followed the pattern established by her predecessors. But the deification also reveals a paradox. The divine Berenice, the Berenice of the temples and the cults and the ritual calendars, was a theological construct, not a person. She was the Lady of the Two Lands, the Great One of the Scepter, the daughter of Amun. These titles described a function: the divine queen, the cosmic partner of the divine king, not an individual. The cult preserved Berenice's name while erasing her individuality, just as the constellation preserved her name while erasing her story. The theological system that honored her as a goddess was the very same system that rendered her invisible and ultimately dispensable as a human person. The honor and the erasure were not contradictory. They were complementary, two aspects of a single process by which the Ptolemaic state absorbed its queens into its ideological apparatus and then discarded the human beings who had been absorbed. The Canopus Decree, a bilingual inscription issued in 238 BC by an assembly of Egyptian priests, provides some of the most important surviving evidence for the religious and political context of Berenice's reign. The decree, discovered in the 19th century and studied extensively by Egyptologists and classicists, records a series of honors bestowed on the Ptolemaic royal family by the Egyptian priesthood. The decree establishes a new festival in honor of the Ptolemies, confirms the deification of their deceased daughter, also named Berenice, a princess who died young and was elevated to divine status by her grieving parents, and provides detailed instructions for the ritual observances that were to be maintained in temples across Egypt. The Canopus Decree is significant for several reasons. First, it demonstrates the close relationship between the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Egyptian priesthood, a relationship that was essential to the dynasty's legitimacy. and that required constant maintenance through gifts, privileges, and the public performance of piety. Second, it reveals the grief that Ptolemy and Berenice experienced at the death of their young daughter, a rare glimpse of personal emotion in a record that is otherwise dominated by political and theological formulae. Third, it confirms Berenice's status as a major figure in the Ptolemaic religious system. She is mentioned alongside Ptolemy III as a co-recipient of priestly honours, and her titles and epithets are recorded with the same care and prominence as the king's. But the decree also illustrates the limitations of the evidence. It tells us about Berenice's theological status. It tells us about her position in the priestly calendar. It tells us nothing about her personal life, her daily activities, her thoughts, her feelings, her relationships with the people around her. The decree is a public document produced by an institution, the priesthood, for an institutional purpose, the confirmation of royal honours, and it records only what is relevant to that purpose. The human being behind the divine persona is once again invisible. The death of Berenice's young daughter, the princess who was deified in the Canopus decree, is one of the few moments in the surviving record where the emotional reality of Berenice's life becomes visible. The loss of a child is a universal human experience, and the elaborate ritual response that Ptolemy and Berenice organized for their daughter's death suggests the depth of their grief. The princess was given divine honors, temples, festivals, a gold statue borne in processions alongside the images of the great gods. The response was, in one sense, a political act. The deification of the princess strengthened the dynasty's claim to divine status and created a new focus for religious devotion in the temples. But it was also, almost certainly, an expression of genuine sorrow, the desperate attempt of bereaved parents to give their lost child a form of immortality that the physical world had denied her. The reign of Ptolemy III and Berenice II, the roughly 2 decades from 246 to 222 BC, represented the high point of Ptolemaic power and culture. The Third Syrian War expanded the empire to its greatest extent. The library and the Mautian were at the height of their intellectual productivity. The court poets produced some of the masterpieces of Hellenistic literature. The economy was productive, the administration was effective, and the kingdom was at peace for extended periods. The combination of military success, cultural achievement, and administrative stability that characterized this period was not accidental. It was the product of effective governance that was, in all probability, a partnership between a capable king and a capable queen, even though the record credits only the king, and then Ptolemy III died. The date is approximately 222 BC, and what followed was a catastrophe. Ptolemy IV Philopator, the son of Ptolemy III and Berenice, ascended to the throne. He was young. He was, by most ancient accounts, more interested in pleasure than in governance. He was surrounded by a coterie of advisors, most notably Sosibius and Agathocles, who were more concerned with their own power than with the stability of the state. And one of his first acts as king, or one of the first acts carried out in his name by his advisors, was the murder of his mother. The ancient sources describe the murder of Berenice with the same combination of brevity and horror that characterizes their accounts of other acts of Ptolemaic dynastic violence. The details are sparse. Polybius, the Greek historian who is the primary source for this period, states that Ptolemy IV had his mother killed shortly after his accession. Justin provides a slightly fuller account, suggesting that Berenice was murdered along with Ptolemy III's brother Lysimachus and other members of the royal family, a purge designed to eliminate any potential rivals to the new king's authority. The motive was political. The advisors who controlled the young king feared that Berenice, as queen mother, would exercise the kind of political influence that earlier Ptolemaic queens had wielded, and that would threaten their own position at court. The murder of the queen mother was not an act of passion. It was an act of political calculation, carried out by men who understood that a powerful queen mother was a threat to their control of a weak king, and who chose to eliminate the threat by eliminating the woman. Berenice, the athlete, the patron, the goddess, the woman who had killed Demetrius the Fair with her own hands and governed Egypt during her husband's absence, was killed by the court officials who served her own son. The woman who had shaped the dynasty was destroyed by the dynasty she had shaped. But here is the problem. The murder, the single most important event in Berenice's life from the perspective of human drama, is documented in a handful of sentences by authors who wrote decades or centuries after the event. There is no detailed account of how Berenice died. There is no record of her response, whether she fought, whether she pleaded, whether she faced her killers with the same courage she had shown when she killed Demetrius in Cyrene. There is no memorial, no monument, no inscription that acknowledges the murder or mourns the victim. The dynasty moved on. The temples continued to function. The cult of the deified Berenice continued to receive offerings. The priests continued to pour libations and burn incense before the image of a goddess who had been murdered by her own son. The theological system was capable of worshipping a dead queen as a goddess, while the political system that killed her continued to operate without interruption. The murder of Berenice II was not unique in Ptolemaic history. The dynasty had a long and bloody tradition of intra-family violence. Brothers killed brothers, sons killed fathers, mothers plotted against children. The Ptolemaic royal house was, by any standard, one of the most violent and dysfunctional families in the ancient world. But the murder of Berenice is significant because of who she was. Not merely a queen, but a queen of extraordinary capability and public visibility. A woman who had been celebrated by the greatest poets of her age, who had won athletic victories at the Pan-Hellenic Games, who had been worshipped as a living goddess. The murder of Berenice II demonstrated with brutal clarity that none of these remarkable achievements, not the poetry, not the athletic glory, not the divine status, could protect a woman from the lethal dynamics of Ptolemaic court politics. The system that elevated her was the same system that destroyed her, and the record that celebrated her was the same record that buried her murder in a few terse sentences and moved on. The silence that followed Berenice's murder is the deepest silence in her story, deeper than the silence about her administrative activities, deeper than the silence about her personal life, deeper even than the silence about her athletic training and her management of the chariot teams that won at Nemea. It is the silence of a civilization that had watched one of its most remarkable women be murdered and had decided, collectively, that the murder was not worth discussing. The poets who had celebrated her hair did not lament her death. The astronomers who had named a constellation after her did not record how her life ended. The priests who maintained her cult did not acknowledge the circumstances of her deification. The silence was comprehensive, and it has lasted for more than 2,200 years. The reign of Ptolemy IV, the son who almost certainly ordered his mother's murder, was, by almost every measure, a disaster. The careful governance, the military ambition, the cultural patronage that had characterized the reign of Ptolemy III gave way to indolence, corruption, and mismanagement. Ptolemy IV was more interested in Dionysiac revels and literary amusements than in the responsibilities of kingship. His advisors, Sosibius and Agathocles, enriched themselves at the expense of the state, while the empire that Ptolemy III had expanded began to contract. The territories won in the Third Syrian War were lost. The Egyptian population, increasingly alienated from a dynasty that seemed more interested in luxury than in justice, began to rebel. The great revolts of Upper Egypt that would plague the Ptolemaic state for decades began during Ptolemy IV's reign or shortly after it. The contrast between the reign of Ptolemy III, the reign in which Berenice played an active and probably decisive role, and the reign of Ptolemy IV, the reign in which Berenice was murdered and her influence eliminated, is the most powerful argument for Berenice's importance. The kingdom that functioned effectively under her partnership with Ptolemy III began to fail the moment she was removed. The administration that had managed Egypt's economy through the disruptions of the Third Syrian War could not manage it through the peacetime indolence of Ptolemy IV's court. The diplomatic relationships that had maintained the Ptolemaic sphere of influence across the eastern Mediterranean frayed and collapsed. The military forces that had projected Ptolemaic power to the borders of Mesopotamia retreated to the Nile Valley. Everything that Berenice had helped to build was, within a generation of her death, in ruins. The correlation is not proof of causation. The decline of the Ptolemaic state had many causes, structural, economic, and demographic, that cannot be attributed to the removal of any single individual. But the timing is suggestive, and the pattern, a capable queen removed by a weak king's advisors, followed by a period of rapid decline, is one that recurs across the history of monarchical states. The people who eliminate the competent are rarely competent themselves, and the consequences of their actions are borne not by them, but by the states they govern. Berenice's story illuminates a broader pattern, the pattern of Ptolemaic queenship across the dynasty's 300-year history. To understand what Berenice achieved and what she lost, we need to place her within the lineage of women who preceded and followed her. Women who wielded varying degrees of power within a system that was, by the standards of the ancient world, unusually accommodating of female political authority, and yet, in the end, consumed every one of them. The first figure in this lineage is Arsinoe II, the queen who established the template for Ptolemaic female power and whose career represents the highest point of queenly visibility before Cleopatra. Arsinoe was the daughter of Ptolemy I and the sister wife of Ptolemy II Philadelphus. Her life before her marriage to Ptolemy II was marked by extraordinary upheaval. She had been married twice previously, first to Lysimachus, the king of Thrace, and then to her half-brother Ptolemy Ceraunus, who had murdered her sons. She fled to Egypt, married her full brother Ptolemy II, and embarked on a career of political influence that would transform the institution of Ptolemaic queenship. Arsinoe was worshipped as a goddess during her own lifetime, a departure from the previous Ptolemaic practice of deifying rulers only after death. She appeared on the gold coinage, the octodrachms that circulated throughout the eastern Mediterranean and that served as both economic instruments and political propaganda. She was given her own cult, the cult of Arsinoe Philadelphus, maintained in temples across Egypt by a dedicated priestly establishment funded from the royal treasury. Her influence on foreign policy was significant. The ancient sources suggest that she played an active role in military planning and diplomatic negotiations, and some scholars have argued that the decisive naval victory at the Battle of Kos, which established Ptolemaic dominance over the Aegean, was achieved under her direct influence. The precedent that Arsinoe established, the queen as co-ruler, as patron, as goddess, as an active participant in the governance of the state, was the precedent that Berenice inherited and built upon. The similarities between the two queens are striking. Both came from outside the immediate Ptolemaic royal family. Arsinoe through her marriages to non-Ptolemaic kings before her return to Egypt, Berenice through her birth in Cyrenaica. Both demonstrated extraordinary personal courage in crisis. Arsinoe surviving the murder of her sons by Ptolemy Ceraunus, Berenice killing Demetrius the Fair in her mother's bedroom. Both wielded genuine political authority during their reigns. Authority that was expressed through patronage, through religious cult, and through the management of the state during periods of royal absence or incapacity, and both were ultimately consumed by the dynasty they had served. Arsinoe dying in circumstances that remain unclear, Berenice murdered on the orders of her own son. The second comparison takes us to Berenice I, the grandmother of Berenice II, and the wife of Ptolemy I Soter. Berenice I was a woman of comparatively modest origins. She came to Egypt as a lady-in-waiting to Eurydice, the first wife of Ptolemy I, and eventually replaced Eurydice as the king's primary partner. Her elevation from attendant to queen is one of the earliest examples in Ptolemaic history of a woman whose personal qualities, rather than her royal blood, secured her position at the apex of the dynasty. The name Berenice that recurs throughout Ptolemaic history, there are at least 4 Ptolemaic queens named Berenice, derives from this first Berenice, whose personal success established the name as a dynastic inheritance. The broader comparison extends beyond the Ptolemaic dynasty to the wider pattern of female rulership in ancient Egypt. Sobekneferu, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh at the end of the 12th dynasty, roughly 1500 years before Berenice, represents the earliest confirmed female pharaoh in Egyptian history. Sobekneferu's reign was brief, perhaps 3 or 4 years, and the sources that document it are sparse. But her very existence demonstrates that the Egyptian political system was, under certain circumstances, willing to accept female rulership, a willingness that sets Egypt apart from most other ancient civilizations, and that provides the deep historical context for the Ptolemaic dynasty's relatively generous accommodation of female political authority. Hatshepsut, who ruled Egypt as pharaoh during the 18th dynasty, roughly 1200 years before Berenice, represents the most famous and the most successful example of female pharaonic authority before Cleopatra. Hatshepsut ruled for roughly 20 years, a reign that was marked by economic prosperity, architectural achievement, and successful military campaigns. Her later erasure, the chiseling of her name and image from monuments that occurred roughly 20 years after her death, was long interpreted as evidence of hostility to female rule, but has been reinterpreted by scholars like Peter Dorman as an act of institutional maintenance rather than personal vendetta, a recalibration of the historical record designed to normalize the succession rather than to punish the woman who had disrupted it. The comparison with Berenice is illuminating. Both women wielded genuine political authority, both were celebrated during their reigns, and both were subject to forms of posthumous erasure that diminished their visibility in the historical record. The mechanisms differed. Hatshepsut's erasure was physical, the chisel. Berenice's was structural, the silence. But the result was the same: the reduction of a remarkable woman to a name without a story. The comparison extends further when we consider the evidence base for each woman. Hatshepsut left behind an extraordinary archaeological legacy. Her mortuary temple at Deir el-Bahari is one of the masterpieces of Egyptian architecture. Her obelisks at Karnak are among the tallest surviving from ancient Egypt, and the reliefs that decorated her monuments record her divine birth, her coronation, and the famous trading expedition to the land of Punt. Berenice left behind no comparable archaeological legacy, no mortuary temple, no obelisks, no monumental reliefs that tell the story of her life. The disparity in the scale and permanence of the surviving evidence is not a reflection of Berenice's lesser importance as a historical figure. It is a reflection of the different recording practices of the New Kingdom and the Ptolemaic period. The New Kingdom pharaohs built monumental tombs and temples as a matter of course, while the Ptolemaic rulers, despite their enormous wealth, left fewer personalized monuments and relied more heavily on coinage, literary production, and the maintenance of the Egyptian temple system for their public presentation. The result is that Berenice's historical legacy is considerably more fragile than Hatshepsut's, more dependent on the precarious survival of papyrus texts and small portable objects like coins, more vulnerable to the unpredictable and often cruel accidents of preservation that ultimately determine what we know and do not know about the ancient past. The third exploration concerns the athletic dimension of Berenice II's career, a dimension that sets her apart from every other queen in the Ptolemaic tradition, and that deserves sustained analysis. The chariot races in which Berenice competed were not mere entertainments. They were religious events, sacred competitions held in honor of the gods at sanctuaries whose authority transcended the political boundaries of the Greek world. The Nemean Games, the festival at which Berenice is attested to have won, were held every 2 years at the sanctuary of Zeus at Nemea in the northeastern Peloponnese. The games had been established, according to tradition, by Heracles himself and were one of the 4 major Pan-Hellenic festivals that constituted the Periodos, the circuit of sacred games that was the pinnacle of Greek athletic competition. The chariot race was the most prestigious event in the Pan-Hellenic program. It was also the most dangerous. The racecourse at Nemea, like those at Olympia, Delphi, and Corinth, was a hippodrome roughly 600 meters long, with turning posts at each end around which the chariots had to navigate at speed. The turns were the most perilous moments of the race. Chariots traveling at full gallop had to decelerate, turn, and accelerate again in a confined space, with competing chariots pressing in from all sides. Crashes were common. Injuries were routine. Deaths were not unheard of. The chariot race was, in the vocabulary of modern sport, an extreme event, a competition in which the risk of serious harm was accepted as an intrinsic part of the contest. Berenice's victories at Nemea were achieved in this environment, against competitors who had devoted their wealth and their expertise to the pursuit of chariot racing glory. The other entrants were among the richest and most powerful individuals in the Greek world: kings, tyrants, aristocrats, and wealthy citizens who maintained stables of racing horses and employed the best trainers and drivers available. To win against this field was a genuine achievement, a demonstration of the quality of Berenice's horses, the skill of her driver, and the effectiveness of her training program. The fourth exploration concerns the religious cult of Berenice, the system of temples, festivals, and ritual observances that was established in her honor during her lifetime, and that continued in some form after her death. The Ptolemaic ruler cult, the system by which the Ptolemaic kings and queens were worshipped as gods, was one of the most distinctive features of the Ptolemaic state. It was neither purely Greek nor purely Egyptian in its character and operation, but rather a sophisticated hybrid, combining elements of the Greek tradition of hero worship with the Egyptian tradition of divine kingship. The Ptolemies were worshipped in Greek-style temples by Greek-speaking priests using Greek ritual forms. They were also worshipped in Egyptian-style temples by Egyptian-speaking priests using Egyptian ritual forms. The dual cult, maintained in both Greek and Egyptian contexts simultaneously, was a reflection of the dual nature of the Ptolemaic state itself, which governed two populations, spoke two languages, and maintained two parallel religious systems. Berenice's place in this system was significant. She was worshipped alongside Ptolemy III as one of the Theoi Euergetai, the benefactor gods, the divine title that the royal couple received from the Egyptian priesthood. The title was confirmed in the Canopus Decree, which stipulated the ritual observances that were to be maintained in their honor across the entire Egyptian temple system. The decree specified the festivals, the offerings, the processions, and the other ritual activities that were to be performed in the names of the benefactor gods. A comprehensive liturgical program that integrated the royal cult into the fabric of Egyptian religious life. The ritual calendar established by the Canopus Decree was extensive. Festivals were to be celebrated on specific dates. Offerings of bread, beer, wine, and incense were to be made at prescribed intervals. Processions were to be organized. Hymns were to be sung, and the sacred images of the benefactor gods were to be carried through the temple precincts with appropriate ceremony. The entire apparatus of Egyptian religion, the priesthood, the temple estates, the ritual calendars, was mobilized in support of the royal cult. The cost was enormous. The logistical demands were considerable, and the result was a system of worship that placed the Ptolemaic rulers at the center of Egyptian religious life, not as foreigners imposing an alien cult, but as legitimate pharaohs continuing the age-old tradition of divine kingship that connected the ruler to the cosmic order. Berenice's position within this system was both powerful and precarious. As a living goddess, she was honored with all the trappings of divinity: temples, festivals, offerings, sacred images, priestly attendants. As a mortal woman, she was vulnerable to the political dynamics of the court, the rivalries, the intrigues, the lethal calculations that made the Ptolemaic palace one of the most politically dangerous and personally lethal environments in the entire ancient world. The tension between the divine status and the mortal vulnerability is the central paradox of Berenice's reign, and the central paradox of Ptolemaic queenship in general. The system could elevate a woman to the status of a goddess. It could not prevent a courtier from putting a blade in her back. The comparison with other royal women who combined religious authority with political vulnerability is illuminating. Puduhepa, the great queen of the Hittite Empire, who negotiated the peace treaty with Ramesses II that ended one of the longest wars in ancient history, wielded extraordinary religious authority as a high priestess of the goddess Hepat. Her religious role gave her a degree of institutional power that was independent of her husband's military authority. And yet even Puduhepa's religious power was not sufficient to protect her from the vicissitudes of dynastic politics. After the death of her husband, her political influence waned, and the record falls silent on the circumstances of her death. The pattern is consistent. Religious authority can amplify a queen's political power, but cannot replace it. When the political conditions that supported the queen's position changed, when a new king came to power, when a new faction gained control of the court, when the balance of power shifted in directions unfavourable to the queen, the religious authority was not sufficient to sustain her. The goddess could be worshipped, while the woman was marginalised. The cult could continue while the queen was murdered. The fifth exploration takes us beyond the Ptolemaic world entirely, to the broader pattern of women and athletics in the ancient world, and to the question of what Berenice's athletic career tells us about the possibilities and limitations of female public life in antiquity. The ancient world was not uniformly hostile to female athletic participation. The spectrum ranged from Sparta, where women were trained in athletics as a matter of public policy, and where female athletic competitions were an established part of civic life, to Athens, where women were excluded from athletic competition entirely, and where the gymnasium was an exclusively male space. The Hellenistic period in which Berenice lived represented a partial relaxation of the older Greek restrictions on female public activity. Hellenistic queens, women like Arsinoe II, Berenice II, and later Cleopatra VII, exercised forms of public authority that would have been unthinkable in classical Athens. They appeared on coins. They received divine honours. They participated, through their chariot entries, in athletic competitions. The Hellenistic period was not a golden age of gender equality. The fundamental structures of patriarchal authority remained firmly in place, but it was a period of greater flexibility than what had come before, a period in which exceptional women could, under the right circumstances, achieve forms of public visibility and political authority that were denied to women in earlier periods. Berenice exploited this flexibility to the fullest extent the system would allow. She competed at the games. She was worshipped as a goddess. She governed Egypt during her husband's absence. She was celebrated in poetry and honoured in astronomy. She pushed the boundaries of what was possible for a woman in the Hellenistic world, not by breaking the rules, but by using every loophole, every precedent, and every available mechanism to expand her own authority and visibility within a system that was, at its core, designed to serve the interests of men. The question of what Berenice's athletic career meant to her personally, as distinct from what it meant politically, is one that the sources do not allow us to answer, but that is worth asking. Did she love horses? Did she feel the thrill of competition, the rush of adrenaline that comes from watching a chariot team thunder toward the turning post at full gallop? Did she take personal pride in her victories, the kind of deep, visceral satisfaction that comes from proving oneself in a contest of excellence? Or was the athletic career purely instrumental, a calculated exercise in political self-presentation, undertaken not for the joy of competition, but for the prestige it conferred? The answer is almost certainly some combination of both: personal passion and political calculation, love of the sport and awareness of its propaganda value. But we cannot know the proportions. We cannot separate the athlete from the queen, because the record does not distinguish between them. The public dimension and the private dimension are merged in the few sources that survive, and the private dimension, the personal, the emotional, the individual, is the dimension that is always lost first. The comparison with modern female athletes is instructive, if imperfect. The barriers that Berenice faced, the cultural assumption that athletic competition was a male preserve, the need to justify her participation in terms that a patriarchal society would accept, the constant pressure to present her achievements as evidence of divine favour or royal excellence, rather than as personal accomplishments, are barriers that female athletes continued to face for more than 2,000 years after Berenice's death. The modern women's suffrage movement, the fight for women's inclusion in the Olympic Games, the ongoing struggle for equal treatment of women's sports, all of these are chapters in a story that began, in one sense, with women like Siniska and Berenice, who demonstrated that women could compete and win in the most prestigious athletic competitions the world had to offer. The connection between athletic excellence and political authority is also worth exploring in the context of Berenice's career. In the Greek world, athletic victory was not merely a personal achievement. It was a demonstration of divine favor, evidence that the gods had chosen to bestow their grace on the victor. For a Ptolemaic queen to win at the Panhellenic Games was to receive a form of divine endorsement that transcended the ordinary mechanisms of political legitimacy, the endorsement of marriage, of birth, of priestly decree. It was a direct, personal, and public demonstration that the gods approved of this woman and her position. In a world where political authority was intimately linked to divine favor, athletic victory was not a distraction from politics. It was politics, conducted on the racecourse rather than in the council chamber, but no less significant for that. The sixth exploration returns to the question that has haunted this entire series, the question of what survives and what is lost, and why. Berenice's legacy survives in fragments, a constellation, a few poems, a handful of coins, a few inscriptions, a mention in Polybius, a reference in Justin, a decree from the Egyptian priesthood. These fragments are all that remain of a woman who was one of the most remarkable individuals of her age. A woman who killed, governed, competed, worshipped, and was worshipped in return. The fragments are enough to reconstruct the outline of her life, enough to know that she existed, that she mattered, that she was extraordinary. But they are not enough to know her, not enough to hear her voice, not enough to understand her thoughts, her feelings, her daily experiences, her relationships with the people who surrounded her. The outline is there, the substance is gone. The comparison with her husband is instructive. Ptolemy III is well documented in the ancient sources. His military campaigns, his building projects, his diplomatic relationships, his religious policies are recorded in multiple texts and inscriptions. He is a historical figure, a person with a biography, a career, a sequence of decisions and achievements that can be followed in detail across the decades of his reign. Berenice is not a historical figure in the same sense. She is a collection of fragments, brilliant, suggestive, tantalizing fragments, but fragments nonetheless. The gap between the documentation of the king and the documentation of the queen is not a reflection of their relative importance. It is a reflection of the priorities of the recording system, a system that valued military glory over administrative competence, public spectacle over private governance, and the deeds of men over the achievements of women. The seventh exploration takes us to the aftermath of Berenice's death, to the question of what happened to the Ptolemaic dynasty and the Ptolemaic state after the woman who had helped build them was removed. The reign of Ptolemy IV, which lasted from approximately 222 to 204 BC, was a period of dramatic decline. The military successes of Ptolemy III were not sustained. The territories won in the Third Syrian War were gradually lost. The Seleucid Empire, recovering from the disruption of the Laodicean War, reasserted its control over the contested regions of Syria and the Levant. The internal administration of Egypt deteriorated. The efficient bureaucracy that had been maintained under Ptolemy III became bloated, corrupt, and unresponsive. The Egyptian population, increasingly resentful of Greek rule, erupted into revolts that would plague the Ptolemaic state for decades. The most serious being the Great Revolt in Upper Egypt that established an independent native Egyptian kingdom in the Thebaid, lasting for roughly 20 years. The connection between Berenice's murder and the subsequent decline is suggestive, but not provable. Many factors contributed to the deterioration of the Ptolemaic state under Ptolemy IV: the king's personal indolence, the corruption of his advisors, the structural pressures of governing a large and diverse population with a small foreign ruling class, the rising power of the Seleucids and the Antigonids, and the growing influence of Rome in the eastern Mediterranean. Berenice's removal was only one factor among many, but it was a significant factor: the sudden and violent elimination of a capable, experienced, and politically astute queen mother from a court that desperately needed capable leadership. The advisors who killed Berenice did so because they feared her influence, and the vacuum that her death created was filled not by competence but by corruption, the systematic corruption of the powerful court ministers Sosibius and Agathocles, whose relentlessly self-interested management of the state accelerated the decline that Berenice's presence might have slowed or prevented. The contrast between the Ptolemaic Empire at the height of Berenice's influence, stretching from Cyrenaica to the Euphrates, patronizing the greatest intellectual community in the ancient world, winning chariot races at the Panhellenic Games, and the Ptolemaic Empire a generation after her death, contracting, rebellious, corrupt, dependent on Roman goodwill for its survival, is the most powerful argument for the importance of what was lost when Berenice was killed. The argument is, of course, circumstantial. It cannot be definitively proved that Berenice would have prevented the decline, but the timing, the swift deterioration of the state immediately after the removal of its most capable female leader is at least consistent with the hypothesis that her presence mattered, that her governance mattered, that the woman who the recording system did not bother to document as an administrator was, in fact, one of the most effective administrators in Ptolemaic history. The Battle of Raphia, fought in 217 BC, roughly 5 years after Berenice's murder, provides a vivid illustration of the changed circumstances. The battle was a Ptolemaic victory. Ptolemy IV's forces defeated the Seleucid king Antiochus III at the border town of Raphia in modern Gaza. But the victory was achieved only by arming the native Egyptian population for the first time in Ptolemaic history, a desperate and unprecedented measure that had profound, far-reaching, and ultimately destabilizing consequences. The armed Egyptian soldiers, having tasted military power, were no longer willing to accept their subordinate position in the Ptolemaic social hierarchy. The revolts that followed, particularly the Great Theban Revolt that established an independent native dynasty in Upper Egypt, can be traced, at least in part, to the decision to arm the native population at Raphia. It was a decision that a more capable and experienced leadership, the kind of leadership that Berenice might have provided, might have avoided or managed more carefully. The death of Ptolemy IV in 204 BC, followed by the accession of the child king Ptolemy V Epiphanes, plunged the Ptolemaic state into a further crisis. The same pattern repeated itself. Courtiers competing for control of a weak king, the elimination of rival factions through murder and intrigue, the steady erosion of Ptolemaic territory and prestige. The Ptolemaic dynasty survived for another century and a half, limping along in diminished form until the Roman annexation of Egypt following the death of Cleopatra VII in 30 BC. But the Golden Age was over, the period of Ptolemaic greatness, the period of Ptolemy II and Ptolemy III, the period of the library and the lighthouse and the conquests and the chariot victories was finished. And the end of that golden age coincided, with terrible precision, with the murder of the woman who had been at its centre. The correlation is sobering, and the lesson it teaches is one that this series has encountered again and again. The hard won and consistently ignored lesson that the removal of capable women from positions of genuine political power has consequences that extend far beyond the individual who is removed. The consequences are structural, they are institutional, they are generational, they ripple outward through the political system, weakening the foundations that the removed woman had helped to build, creating vulnerabilities that her enemies exploit, and producing a cascade of failures that the system cannot arrest, because the person who might have arrested them is no longer there. The eighth and final exploration in this section concerns the physical evidence, the coins, the inscriptions, and the archaeological remains that survive from Berenice's reign, and that constitute the material foundation for our understanding of her life. The coins are the most important category of physical evidence. Ptolemaic coinage was, by the standards of the ancient world, technically sophisticated and artistically accomplished. The Ptolemaic mints produced gold, silver, and bronze coins in large quantities, coins that served as both economic instruments and political propaganda, carrying the images and names of the Ptolemaic rulers to every corner of the Mediterranean trading world. Berenice appears on several coin issues, her portrait depicted in the Hellenistic style of royal portraiture, Her hair arranged in the characteristic fashion that the Ptolemaic queens adopted, her features rendered with enough individuality to suggest a genuine individualized portrait, rather than a merely generic idealized type. The gold octodrachms that bear Berenice's image, coins of extraordinary quality and considerable value, are among the most important surviving artifacts from her reign. These coins were prestige issues, produced in limited quantities for diplomatic and ceremonial purposes rather than for everyday commerce. They were, in effect, portable portraits of the Queen, miniature works of art that conveyed her image to the kings, ambassadors, and officials who received them as gifts or encountered them in the course of international business. The image they convey is consistent across all issues: a dignified, authoritative woman, her hair veiled or crowned, her expression serious and composed. There is nothing remotely frivolous or decorative about these coin portraits. They show a woman who wished to be seen as a ruler, not as a beauty, not as a consort, but as a sovereign. The inscriptions are fewer and less informative than the coins. The most important is the Canopus Decree, the bilingual inscription that records the honours bestowed on the Ptolemaic royal family by the Egyptian priesthood. The decree mentions Berenice by name and title, confirming her status as a co-recipient of divine honours alongside her husband. It also records the deification of the couple's young daughter, the Princess Berenice, who died in childhood and was elevated to divine status by her grieving parents. The decree is a valuable document for understanding the religious and political context of Berenice's reign, but it tells us little about the Queen herself, her personality, her activities, her daily life. It is a public document, produced for a public purpose, and it records only what was relevant to that purpose. The scarabs, seal impressions, and other small finds that bear Berenice's name or image are scattered across museum collections worldwide. In Cairo, in London, in Paris, in Berlin, in New York. These objects are modest in scale but significant in aggregate. They testify to the ubiquity of Berenice's name in the material culture of mid-3rd century Egypt, a presence that extended far beyond the palace and the temples to the daily life of a kingdom of millions. The scarabs in particular are revealing. These small and carefully carved stone objects, traditionally used as personal seals and as protective amulets, were carried by individuals in their daily lives, pressed into clay to authenticate documents, and buried with the dead as protective talismans. The appearance of Berenice's name on these objects suggests that her authority and her divine status were not merely abstract theological concepts maintained by the priesthood but practical realities that shaped the daily lives of ordinary Egyptians. A farmer in the Fayum, a merchant in the Delta, a priest in Thebes, all might have handled an object bearing the name or image of the Queen, a tangible and intimate connection between the individual Egyptian subject and the institution of Ptolemaic royal power. The geographical distribution of these artifacts across the full extent of Egypt, from the bustling port cities of the Mediterranean coast in the north to the temple complexes near the First Cataract of the Nile in the far south, provides important evidence for the geographical reach of Berenice's cult and the administrative apparatus that supported it. The Ptolemaic state was a centralized bureaucracy, one of the most efficient and most intrusive administrative systems in the ancient world, maintaining detailed records of agricultural production, tax collection, and population movement with a thoroughness that would not be matched in the Western world until the modern era. And the distribution of objects bearing the royal name reflects the extraordinary reach of that bureaucracy across every district and every village of the Egyptian countryside. Every district, every village, every temple was connected to the central administration in Alexandria through a chain of officials, tax collectors, and religious functionaries who ensured that the royal authority was felt throughout the kingdom. The objects bearing Berenice's name are, in this sense, material traces of the administrative system that she almost certainly helped to manage during her years as queen. Physical evidence of the vast bureaucratic infrastructure that kept the kingdom functioning, collected its taxes, maintained its canals, fed its population, and projected the authority of the royal house into every corner of the Nile Valley and the coastal territories beyond. The temple reliefs that include Berenice are found primarily in Upper Egyptian temples. The great sanctuaries at Edfu, Dendera, Philae, and Karnak, where the Ptolemaic building program was most active. In these reliefs, Berenice appears rendered in the traditional and deeply conservative Egyptian artistic style, depicted in profile, wearing the traditional regalia of an Egyptian queen, performing the ritual gestures that connected the royal couple to the divine order. The reliefs are formulaic. They follow the conventions of Egyptian temple decoration that had been established centuries earlier, and they tell us little about Berenice as an individual, but they confirm her integration into the Egyptian religious system, her acceptance by the Egyptian priesthood as a legitimate queen and a worthy recipient of divine honors. Taken together, the physical evidence, the coins, the inscriptions, the small finds, the temple reliefs, provides a framework for Berenice's life, but not a biography. The framework tells us that she existed, that she was honored, that she was visible, and that she was integrated into both the Greek and the Egyptian dimensions of the Ptolemaic state. It does not tell us what she thought, what she felt, what she experienced, or what she accomplished beyond the ceremonial and the formulaic. The woman is there, present in the material record, attested by multiple categories of evidence, confirmed as a major figure in mid-3rd century Egyptian history. But the woman is also somehow absent, present as a name, as an image, as a title, but absent as a person. The material record preserves the label, it does not preserve the life. And yet the fragments, taken together, tell a story that is worth telling, not because it is complete, but because its incompleteness is itself instructive. The fragments reveal a woman who was active in every dimension of Ptolemaic public life, athletic, religious, political, cultural. They reveal a woman who was honored by the greatest poets and scientists of her age. They reveal a woman who was integrated into both the Greek and the Egyptian dimensions of the Ptolemaic state, appearing on coins in the Hellenistic style and in temple reliefs in the pharaonic tradition, and they reveal a woman who was, despite all of these achievements, ultimately expendable, murdered by the dynasty she had served, and allowed to fade from the historical record that had once celebrated her. The contrast between Berenice and her near-contemporary Cynisca of Sparta, the first woman to win at the Olympic Games, illustrates the different ways ancient societies could accommodate female athletic achievement. Cynisca won the 4-horse chariot race at Olympia in 396 and 392 BC, roughly a century and a half before Berenice's victories at Nemea. She was a Spartan princess, the daughter of King Archidamus II, and her entry in the Olympic chariot race was, according to Plutarch, encouraged by her brother Agesilaus II, as a way of demonstrating that chariot racing was a test of wealth rather than of personal skill, and therefore not a genuine measure of excellence. The political context of Cynisca's victories was thus different from Berenice's. Cynisca was being used to make a point about the limitations of athletic prestige, while Berenice was using her victories to enhance her own prestige and that of the Ptolemaic dynasty. But the parallel is instructive in other ways. Cynisca commissioned a statue at Olympia commemorating her victories, a monument that was inscribed with a verse celebrating her as the only woman to have won at the Olympic Games. The statue and its inscription were a permanent memorial, visible to every visitor to the sanctuary, a constant reminder that a woman had triumphed in the most prestigious athletic competition in the Greek world. The statue is lost. Like most ancient bronze statues, it was presumably melted down in antiquity, but the inscription was recorded by the ancient traveller Pausanias and has survived in his text. Cynisca's victory, unlike Berenice's, has been continuously remembered. It is mentioned in virtually every history of ancient Greek athletics and every discussion of women in the ancient world. Berenice's victories at Nemea, by contrast, are known only to specialists, mentioned in Posidippus's recently discovered epigrams, and in a few scholarly discussions, but absent from the mainstream narrative of ancient athletic history. The difference in visibility is not a reflection of the relative importance of the two achievements. It is a reflection of the different contexts in which they were preserved. Cynisca's victory was preserved by Pausanias, a writer whose description of Greece became one of the standard reference works for classical archaeology, and whose account of the monuments at Olympia has been read continuously since antiquity. Berenice's victories were preserved by Posidippus, a poet whose work was lost for more than 2,000 years and only rediscovered on a papyrus in the 1990s. The survival of the evidence determined the survival of the memory. Cynisca was remembered because Pausanias survived. Berenice was forgotten because Posidippus was lost. The contingency of the evidence, the sheer accident of which texts survived and which were destroyed, is one of the most humbling realities of ancient historical study. Our knowledge of the past is not determined by what was important. It is determined by what happened to survive. The cult of Berenice, her deification and her worship in Egyptian temples, connects her to the broader tradition of Ptolemaic ruler cult that we examined in our discussion of Cleopatra. The Ptolemaic ruler cult was one of the most distinctive features of the dynasty, a hybrid institution that combined Greek traditions of hero worship with Egyptian traditions of divine kingship. The rulers were worshipped in Greek-style temples by Greek-speaking priests and in Egyptian-style temples by Egyptian-speaking priests, creating a dual religious system that mirrored the dual cultural identity of the Ptolemaic state. Berenice's position in this system was significant. She was worshipped alongside Ptolemy III as one of the Theoi Euergetai, the benefactor gods. The title was confirmed by the Egyptian priesthood in the Canopus decree and carried specific ritual obligations, festivals, offerings, processions, and other observances that were to be maintained in temples across the entire Egyptian religious establishment. The decree specified the calendar of observances, the types of offerings to be made, and the ritual formulas to be employed, creating a comprehensive liturgical program that integrated the royal couple into the fabric of Egyptian religious life. The cult survived Berenice's death. This is a significant point. Even after she was murdered by her son's agents, the temples continued to offer worship to the deified Berenice. The priests continued to burn incense before her image. The festivals established in her honor continued to be observed. The cult was an institution. Once established, it had its own momentum, its own priestly staff, its own economic base in the endowments that supported it. The murder of the flesh and blood woman did not destroy the theological goddess. The divine Berenice endured even as the human Berenice was eliminated. The irony is bitter but illuminating. The cult demonstrates both the power and the limitation of the Ptolemaic system's treatment of its queens. The system could make a woman a goddess. It could establish her worship in every temple in Egypt. It could place her name alongside the names of the ancient gods in the liturgical calendar, but it could not protect her from the violence of the dynasty she served. The deification was real, theologically, institutionally, and ritually. The protection it conferred was not. The goddess could be worshipped while the woman was murdered. The system separated the person from the persona and then destroyed the person while preserving the persona. The cult of Berenice is not a memorial to a woman. It is a memorial to a theological concept, the concept of the divine queen, the sacred partner of the divine king. The woman behind the concept was dispensable. The concept was not. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of Berenice's story, and the deepest lesson of the entire series we have been exploring. The systems that ancient civilizations created to honor their queens, the cults, the temples, the poems, the constellations, were not designed to preserve women. They were designed to preserve functions. The function of the divine queen, the function of the devoted wife, the function of the royal mother, the function of the celestial beloved. The individual woman who occupied the function was, from the system's perspective, interchangeable. Any woman of sufficiently prestigious birth and appropriate dynastic connections could fill the role. The system needed a divine queen. It did not need Berenice specifically, and when the woman behind the function became politically inconvenient, she could be removed, while the function itself continued, undisturbed, in the temples and the rituals and the stars. Step back now from the fragments and the frustrations, from the poems and the coins and the constellation that still shines in the night sky. Step back from the specific story of Berenice II and look at what her story reveals about the deeper structures of memory, achievement, and the way civilizations decide what to remember. What does it mean to have your name in the stars and your story in the dust? This is the paradox of Berenice's legacy, and it is a paradox that illuminates something fundamental about the nature of memorialization. The constellation Coma Berenices is permanent, or as permanent as anything in the universe can be. The stars that compose it will burn for billions of years. The name that Konon of Samos attached to them has been passed down through more than 2,000 years of astronomical tradition and is now enshrined in the official catalogue of the International Astronomical Union. The name will endure as long as human civilization endures, and possibly longer, encoded in the databases and star charts that might survive even the extinction of the civilization that created them. But the name is empty. It is a label, a pointer to a woman who once existed, without any content attached. The name says Berenice. It offers that single word to anyone who asks. But it does not say who Berenice was, what she did, what she endured, what she achieved, or how she died. It does not say that she killed Demetrius the Fair. It does not say that she won chariot races at Nemea. It does not say that she governed Egypt while her husband conquered Syria. It does not say that she was murdered by her own son. The name is there. The person is gone. The memorialization succeeded in the most literal sense. The name is preserved, and it failed in every meaningful sense. The person behind the name has vanished. Let that sink in. The paradox has a modern parallel. We live in an age that generates memorials at an unprecedented rate. Monuments, buildings, streets, institutions, awards, scholarships, all bearing the names of people who are considered worthy of remembrance. Many of these names are already empty, labels attached to institutions whose users have no idea who the person was or what they did. How many students walk through buildings named for donors or founders whose biographies they have never read? How many streets bear names that their residents cannot explain? How many awards are given in honor of people whose achievements the recipients have never studied? The proliferation of names is not the same as the preservation of memory. Names are cheap. Memory is expensive. It requires not just a label, but a story, a narrative that gives the name content, that connects it to a life, that makes the person behind the name real and comprehensible to people who never knew them. Berenice has the label. She does not have the story, or rather, she has a story that most people have never heard. The constellation bears her name. The poems celebrate her devotion, but the narrative, the connected, comprehensive, accessible narrative that would make Berenice real to a modern audience, does not exist outside of specialized academic studies that are read by a few hundred scholars and ignored by everyone else. The academic literature on Berenice is small but serious. Scholars like Sarah Pomeroy, whose work on women in the Hellenistic world has done much to recover the lives of queens like Berenice, and Elizabeth Donnelly Carney, whose studies of Hellenistic royal women have placed figures like Arsinoe and Berenice in their proper historical context. But the scholarly recovery has not reached the general public. Berenice remains, for the vast majority of people around the world, a complete unknown, a name in a star catalogue, a footnote in a textbook that no one reads, a ghost haunting the archives of a great civilization that the modern world barely remembers. The scholarly recovery deserves attention because it represents an important counter-narrative to the story of erasure we have been telling. Over the past several decades, a generation of historians, many of them women, working in fields like Hellenistic history, ancient gender studies, and the archaeology of the Greek and Roman worlds, has systematically recovered the lives and achievements of ancient women who were previously invisible, marginalized, or fundamentally misrepresented in the mainstream historical narrative. The recovery has been slow, methodical, painstaking, and often deeply frustrating, limited by the persistent scarcity of primary sources, by the biases embedded in the surviving record, and by the institutional pressures of an academic system that has not always valued work on women's history. But it has been real. The work of Pomeroy, Carney, Grace McCurdy, and others has created a body of scholarship that makes it possible, for the first time in modern history, to tell the stories of women like Berenice with the depth and seriousness they deserve. The challenge now is to move the recovery beyond the academy, to translate the careful scholarly findings into vivid and accessible narratives that can reach the general public, the students in classrooms, the viewers of documentaries, the readers of popular history. The constellation is there, the fragments are there, the scholarship is there. What has been missing is the bridge between the scholarly community and the public, the storytellers, the filmmakers, the documentarians who can take the careful, qualified findings of the historians and transform them into narratives that are vivid, compelling, and true. The bridging work is not a betrayal of scholarship. It is the fulfillment of scholarship's purpose, to create knowledge that changes how people understand the world. Knowledge that remains confined to academic journals is knowledge that has not yet completed its journey. The journey is complete only when the knowledge reaches the people who need it. The people who look up at the night sky and see a constellation they cannot name, a pattern of stars whose story they have never heard. This is not science fiction. This is the actual condition of historical memory for the vast majority of people who have ever lived. The names survive, the people do not, the memorials endure, the memories fade, and the gap between the name and the person, between the label and the life, grows wider with each passing generation, until the name becomes nothing more than a sound, a mark on a map, a dot in the sky. The question that remains, the question that this series has been circling around since its first episode, is whether the forgetting can be reversed. Not completely, not perfectly. The information that was never recorded cannot be retroactively created. The inner life of Berenice II, her thoughts, her feelings, her daily experiences, is gone. No amount of scholarship, no amount of archaeological discovery, no amount of documentary filmmaking can restore what the ancient recording system chose not to preserve. The gaps are permanent. The silence in its deepest dimensions is final, but the outline can be recovered. The achievements can be documented. The fragments can be assembled into a narrative that, while incomplete, is nonetheless true. True to what we know, honest about what we do not know, and respectful of the woman whose life it attempts to reconstruct. The recovery is not a resurrection. It is a restoration, a partial, imperfect, but genuine restoration of a life that the recording system tried to reduce to a name and a constellation. The restored narrative will always be incomplete. It will always be provisional, subject to revision as new evidence is discovered, as new interpretations are proposed, as new scholars bring new perspectives to the fragments that survive. But it will be there. It will exist. It will be available to anyone who wants to know who Berenice was. Anyone who looks up at the constellation and wants to know the story of the woman whose hair it commemorates. The grief moment of Berenice's story is not her murder, though the murder is terrible enough. The grief moment is the realization that the very mechanisms that were supposed to preserve her memory, the poetry, the astronomy, the divine cult, failed to preserve the most important thing about her, the woman herself. The mechanisms preserved the name, the celestial label that Conon attached to the stars. They preserved the devotion, the image of the faithful wife who cut her hair for her husband's safe return. They preserved the constellation, the permanent, visible, indestructible monument in the night sky. But they did not preserve the athlete who won at Nemea. They did not preserve the killer who struck down Demetrius in Cyrene. They did not preserve the administrator who governed Egypt during the Third Syrian War. They did not preserve the mother who was murdered by her own child. The mechanisms preserved the symbol and lost the substance. And the loss is permanent, because the substance was never recorded in the first place, and what was never recorded can never be recovered. Let that sink in. Consider the taxonomy of erasure that this series has documented across its many episodes. The chisel, the physical destruction of monuments, the overwriting of cartouches, the deliberate obliteration of a person's name and image from the stone. This was the method used against Hatshepsut and Tawosret. Violent, visible, and ultimately incomplete, because the stone preserves traces of even the most determined destruction. The silence, the passive failure to record a person's life, the structural indifference of a recording system that did not consider certain categories of people worth documenting. This was the method that consumed Ti Mereneset. Not a deliberate act of destruction, but a systematic omission that was all the more devastating for being unintentional. The narrative, the replacement of the real person with a fictional character designed to serve the needs of the powerful. This was the method used against Cleopatra, the most sophisticated form of erasure, the most difficult to detect and the most nearly permanent, because the lie it leaves behind acquires the authority of truth through sheer repetition. But Berenice represents something different, a fourth form of erasure that is, in its own way, the most insidious of all. Call it the erasure of abstraction. The mechanisms that were supposed to preserve Berenice did not fail in the conventional sense. They did not destroy her name. The name survives in the sky. They did not ignore her. She was celebrated by the greatest poets and scientists of her age. They did not replace her with a fiction. There is no Berenice caricature in the way there is a Cleopatra caricature. Instead, they abstracted her. They took the specific, particular, irreplaceable human being who was Berenice II, the woman who smelled the dust of the racecourse at Nemea, who felt the blade in her hand in Cyrene, who watched the sun rise over the harbour of Alexandria, who heard the news that her husband had captured Antioch, and they converted her into a symbol, the devoted wife, the divine queen, the constellation. The abstraction preserved the symbol while discarding the substance. The name was saved, the woman was lost, and the loss was accomplished not through violence or neglect, but through the very act of memorialization itself. This is the cruelest irony of Berenice's legacy. The poetry that was written to celebrate her became the instrument of her erasure, because the poetry celebrated the symbol, not the person. Callimachus did not write about the woman who governed Egypt or the athlete who won at Nemea. He wrote about a lock of hair, a symbol of devotion, an emblem of wifely piety, an abstraction that could be placed among the stars, precisely because it had been stripped of everything that was specific, personal, and irreplaceable about the woman it came from. The astronomy that was performed to honor her became the mechanism of her disappearance, because the constellation preserved the name, while the woman behind the name vanished into the emptiness between the stars. The divine cult that was established to worship her became the means by which her individuality was dissolved into a theological category, the category of the divine queen, a role that any sufficiently prestigious woman could fill. Every act of memorialization was, simultaneously, an act of abstraction, a conversion of the specific into the general, the person into the persona, the woman into the goddess. And once the conversion was complete, the woman was gone, absorbed into the symbol, dissolved into the abstraction, as irretrievable as the lock of hair that Conon of Samos claimed the gods had taken up to heaven. The chisel destroys, the silence ignores, the narrative distorts. But the abstraction does something worse. It honors and erases in the same gesture. It elevates a woman to the stars, while removing everything about her that made her a woman rather than a symbol. It is the gentlest form of erasure, and, for that very reason, the hardest to see, the hardest to resist, and the hardest to reverse. The implications of this fourth form of erasure extend far beyond Berenice's story. The abstraction is not unique to the Ptolemaic court. It is a mechanism that operates whenever a society chooses to honor a woman by converting her into an icon. Whenever the specific, messy, contradictory reality of a woman's life is smoothed into a symbol that serves the needs of the culture rather than preserving the truth of the individual. The Virgin Mary is an abstraction, the theological symbol of divine motherhood that replaced the historical woman who lived in 1st century Palestine. Joan of Arc is an abstraction, the nationalist icon of French courage that replaced the historical teenager who heard voices and led an army. Florence Nightingale is an abstraction, the sentimental image of the lady with the lamp that replaced the formidable statistician and public health reformer who transformed military medicine. In every case, the abstraction is more famous than the person. In every case, the symbol has consumed the substance. In every case, the process of memorialization has produced a paradox. The more intensely a woman is honored, the less accurately she is remembered, because the honor is directed at the symbol rather than the person. Berenice's constellation is the purest example of this paradox that this series has encountered. The constellation is literally above us, permanent, beautiful, visible to anyone who knows where to look. And it is literally empty, a name in the sky, pointing at nothing, connected to no story that the average person could tell. The honor is absolute. The erasure is complete. The constellation is the most successful memorial and the most total act of forgetting in the history of this series. The pattern repeats across this series. Hatshepsut built a temple that still stands, and the woman who built it was erased from its walls. Tawosret ruled Egypt as pharaoh, and the record of her reign was chiseled into oblivion. Tmeriset gave Egypt its last great warrior pharaoh, and the record of her life fills barely a paragraph. Cleopatra governed the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean for 21 years, and the record of her governance was buried beneath a Roman caricature. And Berenice II, the athlete, the killer, the queen, the goddess, has her name in the stars and her story in the dust. The grief moment of Berenice's story is not her murder, though the murder is terrible enough. The grief moment is the realization that the very mechanisms that were supposed to preserve her memory, the poetry, the astronomy, the divine cult, failed to preserve the most important thing about her, the woman herself. The mechanisms preserve the name, the celestial label that Conon attached to the stars. They preserve the devotion, the image of the faithful wife who cut her hair for her husband's safe return. They preserved the constellation, the permanent, visible, indestructible monument in the night sky. But they did not preserve the athlete who won at Nemea. They did not preserve the killer who struck down Demetrius in Cyrene. They did not preserve the administrator who governed Egypt during the Third Syrian War. They did not preserve the mother who was murdered by her own child. The mechanisms preserved the symbol and lost the substance. And the loss is permanent, because the substance was never recorded in the first place, and what was never recorded can never be recovered. Let that sink in. There is a deeper dimension to this paradox that connects Berenice's story to the broader crisis of historical memory that haunts every civilization. The mechanisms of memorialization, poetry, astronomy, divine cult, monumental inscription, are mechanisms that preserve names and attributes. They are not mechanisms that preserve lives. A poem can tell you that a woman was devoted. It cannot tell you what her voice sounded like, how she spent her mornings, what she said to her children at bedtime, how she reacted when she heard that her husband had won a battle in Syria, what she felt when she stood at the edge of the racecourse at Nemea and watched her chariot team thunder toward the finish line. A constellation can tell you that someone once cared enough about a woman to name a patch of sky after her. It cannot tell you who that woman was as a human being, what she feared, what she hoped for, what made her laugh, what kept her awake at night. The mechanisms of memorialization preserve the public dimension of a life. They do not preserve the private dimension, and it is the private dimension, the interior life, the daily experience, the relationships and emotions and small moments that constitute the actual texture of human existence, that makes a person real rather than merely commemorated. When we say we know a historical figure, we mean that we have access to enough of the private dimension to form a genuine impression of who they were, to hear their voice in their writings, to sense their personality in their decisions, to feel their presence across the intervening centuries. We know Julius Caesar in this sense. His writings survive, his personality is vivid in the ancient sources, and we can form a genuine impression of the man behind the public figure. We do not know Berenice in this sense. We know her name, we know her titles, we know her attributes, but we do not know her. The private dimension is gone, lost not to destruction or propaganda, but to the simple failure of the recording system to capture what was, by its own standards, not worth capturing. The pattern repeats across this series with devastating consistency. Hatshepsut built a temple that still stands, and the woman who built it was erased from its walls. Tawosret ruled Egypt as pharaoh, and the record of her reign was chiseled into oblivion. Tmeriset gave Egypt its last great warrior pharaoh, and the record of her life fills barely a paragraph. Cleopatra governed the richest kingdom in the Mediterranean for 21 years, and the record of her governance was buried beneath a Roman caricature. And Berenice II, the athlete, the killer, the queen, the goddess, has her name in the stars and her story in the dust. The modern world has not fully resolved this problem. We have better mechanisms of memorialization, digital archives, film, recorded audio, written memoirs, but we still face the same fundamental challenge. The gap between the name and the person, between the public record and the private reality, between what is preserved and what is lost. The women who govern modern states are documented far more thoroughly than Berenice was. Their speeches are recorded, their decisions are archived, their images are photographed from every angle, but the private dimension, the interior life, the daily experience, the human being behind the public figure, remains elusive. And the biases of the recording system, the tendency to focus on the public and the monumental at the expense of the private and the personal, persist in forms that are subtler than the ancient biases but no less pervasive and no less consequential. The common thread is not destruction, it is not propaganda, it is not indifference. The common thread is the structural inability or unwillingness of the recording systems of the ancient world to preserve the full range of women's achievements. The systems could record military campaigns, they could record building projects, they could record religious ceremonies, they could record the movements of the stars, but they could not, or would not, record the lives of women with the same care, the same detail, and the same respect they brought to the recording of men's lives. The failure was not personal, it was systemic, and the consequences of that systemic failure are with us still, in every empty name, in every unread footnote, in every constellation whose story has been forgotten. Look up at the night sky. On a clear, dark night, far from the light pollution of modern cities, you can see the constellation Coma Berenices. It is faint, it requires patience and good eyes, but it is there, a loose scatter of stars between Leo and Butes, occupying a patch of sky that was, for most of astronomical history, unremarkable. And then, one day in the 3rd century BC, a court astronomer pointed at those stars and said, "Those are the hair of the queen." The act of naming changed everything. Before Conon of Samos identified Coma Berenices, the stars were anonymous, points of light without identity, without story, without meaning beyond their position in the sky. After the naming, they became something else, a monument, a memorial, a permanent inscription in the vault of heaven. The naming was an act of creation. It brought something into existence that had not existed before. Not the stars themselves. They had been burning for billions of years, before any human eye had looked at them, before any human mind had organized them into patterns and given those patterns names. But the meaning of the stars, the connection between those distant points of light, and a woman who had cut her hair in a temple on the shore of the Mediterranean, the naming created that connection, a thread of meaning stretching from the surface of the earth to the depths of the night sky. And the connection has endured for more than 2,300 years. The implications of this act extend far beyond ancient astronomy. The naming of Coma Berenices is, in its own way, one of the most powerful demonstrations in human history of the relationship between language and memory. A name, a single word, a few syllables, a particular combination of sounds spoken by a human voice, can preserve a person across millennia, can hold a life in place, while everything else about that life crumbles and disappears. The name is the last thing to go. When the buildings have fallen, when the papyri have rotted, when the coins have been melted down for their metal, and the statues have been smashed or carried away, the name remains, a thread of sound stretching across the silence of centuries, connecting the present to a past that would otherwise be completely inaccessible. But the name without the story is a thread without a fabric. It connects nothing. It leads nowhere. It is a bridge that starts on one side of the abyss and ends in midair. The name Berenice crosses 2,300 years of human history and arrives in the present moment and finds no one waiting on the other side. No one who knows her story. No one who remembers what the name means. The bridge is intact, structurally sound, spanning the full distance of 2,300 years. But the destination is empty. No one waits on the far side. The responsibility falls on us, on the scholars, the educators, the storytellers, the documentarians who choose which stories to tell and which to leave untold. The name is there, the fragments are there, the constellation is there, shining in the night sky above every person on earth who cares to look up. What is missing is the connection, the narrative thread that links the name to the life, the constellation to the queen, the label to the person, making that connection, telling Berenice's story, telling it completely, telling it honestly, telling it in a way that makes her real to people who have never heard her name. is not merely an academic exercise. It is an act of restoration, a small but genuine reversal of the forgetting that has erased one of the most remarkable women of the ancient world. The act of restoration carries its own risks. There is a temptation, when recovering a forgotten figure, to overcorrect, to transform the forgotten woman into a flawless heroine, to sand away the complications and the contradictions, to create a new abstraction in place of the old one. Berenice was not a saint. She killed a man, brutally, decisively, in circumstances that suggest both personal courage and a capacity for violence that should not be sentimentalized. She was a member of the Ptolemaic ruling class, a foreign elite that governed Egypt through a combination of cultural sophistication and coercive force that extracted enormous wealth from the Egyptian peasantry, and that maintained its grip on power through an administrative and military system that was, by any modern standard, fundamentally exploitative. The honest recovery of Berenice's story must include these dimensions: the violence, the privilege, the complicity in a system of imperial extraction, alongside the athletic victories, the cultural patronage, and the administrative competence. The goal is not to create a new icon. The goal is to recover a person, a complete, complex, contradictory human being who was capable of great courage and great violence, who wielded power within a system she did not create and could not fully control, and who was ultimately destroyed by the very system she had served. The pattern of the Ptolemaic queens, Arsinoe, Berenice, Cleopatra, is a pattern of extraordinary achievement followed by systematic erasure. Each queen wielded real power. Each queen was celebrated in her own time, and each queen was, in one way or another, lost, consumed by the violence of the dynasty she served, or buried beneath the propaganda of the empire that defeated it, or simply forgotten by a world that moved on to other stories and other names. The pattern is not unique to the Ptolemaic dynasty. It is the pattern of women's power across the ancient world, a pattern of achievement and erasure, of visibility and forgetting, of names that survive in stone and stories that crumble into dust. Breaking the pattern requires not merely the recovery of individual names, but the reform of the system that produces the erasure. The recording systems of the ancient world cannot be reformed. They are fixed in stone, literally and metaphorically. But the modern recording system, the system of scholarship, education, and cultural production that determines what we know about the past and how we know it, can be reformed. It can be expanded to include women's voices, women's achievements, and women's perspectives. It can be corrected to remove the deep structural biases that the ancient recording systems embedded in the surviving record. It can be enriched with the stories that the ancient systems failed to tell. The reform is already underway. The generation of scholars who have recovered the lives of Ptolemaic queens, Pomeroy, Carney, McCurdy, and others, have laid the foundation for a new understanding of the ancient world, one that includes women not as footnotes or appendices, but as central figures in the political, cultural, and religious life of their societies. The documentaries and popular histories that build on this scholarship, including this series, are extending the recovery to a wider audience, making the stories of women like Berenice accessible to people who will never read a scholarly monograph, but who deserve to know, who have a right to know, that the night sky above their heads bears the name of a remarkable queen. The task is not finished. It may never be finished. The gaps in the record are permanent. The silences of the ancient world cannot be retrospectively filled. But the task is worth pursuing, not because it will restore Berenice to the fullness of life that the recording system denied her, but because every single fragment recovered, every forgotten name restored to memory, every untold story finally told, is a small but real victory against the forces that conspire to erase the achievements of women from the human record. The forces are powerful, institutional, cultural, structural, operating across millennia with a consistency that is both impressive and depressing. But they are not irresistible. They can be identified and understood. They can be opposed. They can be actively countered. And they can be, in small but meaningful ways, reversed. The constellation is permanent. The silence that surrounds it need not be. But breaking the silence requires more than good intentions. It requires a fundamental rethinking of how we approach the ancient past. a willingness to look beyond the monumental and the literary and the theological, and to ask the questions that the ancient recording systems did not ask. Who governed while the king was at war? Who managed the economy while the army was in the field? Who maintained the diplomatic relationships that kept the kingdom safe? Who raised the children who would inherit the throne? These are questions about power, real power, the power that keeps a civilization functioning, and they are questions that the ancient sources rarely answer because the ancient sources were not interested in the answers. The modern historian must be interested in the answers, even when the answers cannot be found, even when the silence is all that remains, because the silence itself is evidence. The absence of a record is not the absence of a life. It is the presence of a bias that valued certain kinds of achievement and ignored others, that celebrated certain kinds of power and rendered others invisible. The story of Berenice II is, in this sense, a test case, a demonstration of what can be recovered from the silence and what cannot. We can recover the outline of her life. We can reconstruct her public career from the coins, the inscriptions, the poems, and the handful of references in the ancient historians. We can identify her achievements, the chariot victories, the religious cult, the probable regency, the political connections that made the Ptolemaic Empire the most powerful state in the Mediterranean. We can identify the manner of her death, the murder ordered by her son's advisors, the political calculation that turned a living queen into a dead goddess. We can do all of this. What we cannot do is know her. We cannot hear her voice. We cannot understand her inner life. We cannot form the kind of intimate, personal connection with her that we can form with historical figures whose writings or detailed biographies survive. And that limitation, the limitation of knowing about a person without knowing them, is the limitation that defines historical memory for the vast majority of people who have ever lived. Most people in history are not Caesar or Cicero or Plutarch, people whose voices survive in their own words, whose personalities are vivid across the centuries. Most people in history are Berenice, known in outline, invisible in substance, present as a name and absent as a person. The difference between the famous and the forgotten is not, in most cases, a difference of importance. It is a difference of mere historical documentation. The people who are remembered are the people whose lives happen to be recorded in forms that survived. The people who are forgotten are the people whose records were lost, or whose lives were never recorded in the first place. The contingency is profound, and it should make us humble about the narratives we construct from the fragments that remain. The responsibility that falls on the modern storyteller, the historian, the documentarian, the educator, is not merely to recover names from the silence. It is to resist the temptation to fill the silence with invention. The gaps in Berenice's story are real. The things we do not know about her, her thoughts, her feelings, her daily experiences, her private relationships, are things we genuinely do not know and cannot recover. The only honest and intellectually responsible response to this limitation is not to fill the gaps with speculation dressed as fact, but to acknowledge the gaps, to present what is known with confidence, what is probable with appropriate qualification, and what is unknown with the genuine humility and intellectual honesty that the unknown demands. There is a constellation in the night sky called Coma Berenices. It is faint, barely visible without good conditions, a scatter of stars that most people have never noticed and that even experienced stargazers often overlook. But it is there. It has been there for 2,300 years, ever since a court astronomer in Alexandria pointed at a patch of sky and said that the gods had taken a queen's hair and placed it among the stars. The queen was Berenice II. She was born in Cyrenaica, on the coast of North Africa, the daughter of a king who had defied the Ptolemies and a mother who had betrayed her. Before she was 20 years old, she killed the man her mother had brought to Cyrene to marry her, killed him in her mother's bedroom, according to the ancient sources, because he had dishonored her by taking her mother as his lover. She spared her mother, ordering that Apama not be harmed, despite everything Apama had done, in a gesture that combined mercy with the cold calculation of a woman who knew that matricide would destroy her political future, even as the killing of Demetrius secured it. She married Ptolemy III, the King of Egypt, in a union that reunited Cyrenaica with the Ptolemaic state and created the most powerful kingdom in the Mediterranean world. She won chariot races at the Great Panhellenic Games, the sacred athletic festivals that were the closest thing the ancient world had to the modern Olympics. She governed Egypt while her husband was at war in Syria and Mesopotamia. She was worshipped as a goddess in temples across the country. She bore children who would inherit the throne, and she was murdered, almost certainly on the orders of her own son, Ptolemy IV, who wanted to remove the powerful Queen Mother whose influence threatened the advisors who controlled his court. The story is extraordinary. The woman was extraordinary. The life, from the blood on the bedroom floor in Cyrene to the chariot dust of Nemea, to the incense smoke of the Alexandrian temples, to the quiet ceremony of placing a lock of hair on an altar, to whatever room she died in, at the hands of men who served her own child, was one of the most dramatic and most varied in the ancient world, and almost no one knows it. The constellation endures. The woman who gave it her name has been forgotten, swallowed by the silence that has consumed the stories of powerful women across 3,000 years of human civilization. The constellation is there every night, shining above the heads of 8 billion people who do not know, and in most cases will never know, that the stars they are looking at bear the name of a queen who competed at the Panhellenic Games, who killed a prince in her mother's bed, who governed a kingdom, and who was murdered by her son. But here is the thing about constellations. They are visible only if you know where to look. You have to know which stars to connect. You have to know the pattern. And once you know the pattern, once someone has pointed at the sky and said, "Those stars there, those are the hair of Berenice," you can never unsee it. The constellation is there every night, whether you see it or not. But once you have seen it, once you have been shown the pattern, it becomes part of your sky. It becomes part of how you see the night. That is what this documentary has tried to do. Not to create the pattern, but to reveal it. The pattern was always there. The stars were always there. The fragments, the coins, the poems, the inscriptions, the references in Polybius and Justin and the Canopus Decree were always there, scattered across the archives and the museums and the libraries, waiting to be assembled into a story. What was missing was the telling, the act of pointing at the scattered fragments and saying, "These belong together. These tell the story of a remarkable woman. These are the life of Berenice II. The forgetting is not permanent. It can be reversed, one story at a time, one name at a time, one documentary at a time. The fragments are there, the coins are there, the poems are there, the constellation is there. And now, for anyone who has listened this far, the story is there too, assembled from fragments, pieced together from the ruins of the ancient record, told in the only way it can be told, incompletely, honestly, with respect for what is known and humility before what is lost. Berenice II was an athlete, a killer, a queen, a goddess, and a victim. She was all of these things, all of them at once, in a single extraordinary life that was richer, more surprising, more complex, and more dramatic than any fictional story could be. She killed a man who wronged her before she was 20. She married a king and helped him build the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean. She won chariot races in the sacred games of Greece. She governed the richest kingdom in the ancient world, while her husband was 1,000 miles away at war. She was worshipped as a goddess in temples across 2 continents. She buried a daughter and mourned her with the elaborate grief of a queen who had the resources to turn sorrow into ritual, and she was killed by the dynasty she had given her life to serve, murdered on the orders of her own child, by men who feared her strength more than they feared the consequences of her absence. And now her story has been told again, spoken into the night, toward the stars that still bear her name. The hair is in the sky, the woman is in the record, and the silence, the long, deep silence that has surrounded her for 2,300 years, has been broken. Not permanently, not completely, but enough. Enough to say that she was here, that she mattered, that the stars remember what the world forgot. The next time you are outside on a clear, dark night, far from the city lights, in a place where the sky is black and the stars are bright, look up. Find the constellation Leo, the lion, one of the brightest and most recognizable patterns in the northern sky. Then look slightly to the east and north, to the space between Leo and the bright orange star Arcturus in Bootis. There, in a patch of sky that seems at first glance to contain nothing at all, you will find a faint scattering of stars. They are not bright, they are not dramatic, they will not leap out at you the way Orion or the Big Dipper does. But they are there. They have been there for billions of years, burning with the quiet persistence of all distant things. Those are the hair of Berenice, named more than 2,300 years ago for a queen who lived and died in the 3rd century BC, a queen of Egypt, a queen of Cyrene, a queen whose life was as dramatic and as consequential as any in the ancient world, a queen who was born on the coast of North Africa and who killed a man in her mother's bedroom before she was 20 years old, a queen who married a king and helped him build an empire, a queen who won chariot races at the sacred games of Greece, a queen who was worshipped as a goddess and murdered by her own son, a queen whose name survives in the sky while her story gathers dust in the archives of a world that has not yet learned to remember its women the way it remembers its men. Look at those stars. They are faint, they are easily overlooked, but they are permanent, or as permanent as anything in this universe can be. They will burn for billions of years after the last copy of the last book about the last pharaoh has crumbled into dust. They are the most enduring memorial that any human being has ever received. And now you know the name of the woman they commemorate. You know her story, or at least, you know as much of her stories as the ancient record has preserved and the modern scholar has been able to recover. You know that she was remarkable. You know that she mattered. And you know that the forgetting, the long, slow, structural forgetting that has consumed her story for 2,300 years, can be reversed. One listener at a time, one viewer at a time, one person looking up at the night sky and saying, "I know who she was, the stars remember." And now, at last, so do you.